everyone, and welcome back. How's everyone doing? I hope everyone's doing well. Welcome to anyone who's new to the channel. So we have gotten some new subscribers, so that's really awesome. Um, okay, so today I'm going to just give an update on what's going on with the war or the conflict. It's not really declared to be a war. It's called a special military operation. But warlike things are happening. So anyway, let's so what I thought we could do is that we could go over the reporting I've done on X. I have summarized things for the past several days on X. We could look at some stuff that analysts are saying and stuff like that. So I'm just kind of winging it because I just did a video reading through the next installment of Provoked. And so I thought while I'm all ready and the kids are still sleeping, I could try to get this episode out. So I'm sort of just going with it. Now, this topic is extremely charged. People are like getting really upset with you if you don't seem like you're completely on board with the whole thing. People are taking your words out of context and stuff like that. I'm trying to be extremely neutral in the whole situation. I'm just trying to report on things like as I see them, like just report on them. I'm not trying to really be super aggressive on both sides, but I'm an American, so I am going to take my country's side. America has troops in harm's way, and we have our allies and stuff like that are in harm's way now. But I also care about the Iranian people, and I care about the other people in the region and stuff like that. So, and I also don't have the same views as necessarily some people have on just this type of stuff in general. I take a lot of this stuff as a United States aggression, but I'm nobody. I can't do anything about it. The war started, so the war started. That's all. What we can't do anything but hope for the best outcome for everybody involved. So that's what I'm hoping for. Now, I also don't think that this is exactly what was planned. Okay, so I think the plan in the beginning was they would come in really, really hard, and then they would take out the head of the government, like the leaders of the government, and then that the people would rise up. For some reason they thought that. I questioned that when I first heard it. I'm like, what are you talking about? But that's because I don't have a comical view of other countries and their people. It's really bothering me, some of the stuff that people say and that they think about people in other countries. So I actually might make a video where we go over the different ethnic groups in Iran and just learn more about Iran and the people, where we actually just see them and watch them and hear them talk and stuff like that. I might make a video on that, maybe even a live stream, because it might be more of a live stream type vibe, because we would just be watching other videos together and stuff. So maybe if you guys want to do that, then we could do that. But I just want to make it super clear that I'm not for the Iranian regime in any possible way. I don't like them. I'm not for them or whatever. I'm just also realistic that this kind of stuff is going to cause, or has the potential. I don't know if it's necessarily going to cause, but it has the potential to make things in the region like just explode like a powder keg, and then we can't put that back down very easily or back into the proverbial toothpaste tube very easily. But I'm hoping out for the best for everybody. So let's go to my X. Okay, so whenever I leave the screen, it will freeze, and I don't want to just be stuck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw up my avatar while I'm off. Okay, I'm just going to remove me from the stage while I'm reading. Let's just do that. Okay, so this is my last 48 hours update that I did, not last night, but the night before. So U.S.-Iran conflict update last 48 hours. So military developments. U.S. and Israeli forces continued air and missile strikes targeting Iranian military infrastructure, logistics sites, and facilities connected to energy storage and transport. So there was a giant fire that overtook Tehran, and it was like black smoke everywhere. I don't know if it's still like that. Maybe it is. I don't know. But it was on fire for a long time, just oil smoke. And it looked really bad. Now, I don't know how much of the area it affected, but I was hearing reports that the air quality there was like extremely bad. And then it also started to rain, and people said that was going to make it even worse. Iranian forces and allied groups continue missile and drone attacks targeting U.S. bases, Israeli targets, and infrastructure in several Gulf states. So Iranian forces are targeting Gulf states. I think the United Arab Emirates got it the worst, and then I think after that Bahrain, but we'll go over that because I have that information. Additional strikes were reported near energy-related infrastructure and fuel depots, raising concerns about the vulnerability of oil supply networks. Fighting has remained concentrated around strategic military sites, but several strikes have occurred near populated areas. Strait of Hormuz situation. Maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz remains highly unstable. Now, I heard today that it was resuming again. So remember, this was not last night, but the night before. And then I also have to edit this video, so this is going to be outdated. But I do believe that traffic has started moving again in the Strait of Hormuz. I will have to double check on that. So this is just, remember, this is just up until like the 8th. So this update is up until the 8th of March. Hey guys, so it's that time where I need to ask you to subscribe to the channel. And if you're already subscribed, just hit the like, please. If you don't do this, I will be abducted by aliens. Thanks. Maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz remains highly unstable. Tanker traffic through the strait has dropped significantly. Commercial shipping companies delay or reroute vessels due to missile threats and military warnings. And let me show you. Okay, so this is why the Navy, so they took out Iran's Navy, right? But Iran doesn't rely on the big warships alone. Actually, they don't rely on them much at all. They have thousands and thousands of these small, fast boats armed with anti-ship missiles spread along the coast and Gulf waterways. These boats operate like a naval mosaic defense, striking from multiple angles and quickly dispersing, make it nearly impossible to neutralize their threat by targeting a few vessels. Even if one ship is sunk, hundreds of others remain ready, creating a persistent, hard-to-stop maritime threat. This strategy turns the Gulf into a dangerous zone for any naval force, forcing constant vigilance and layered defenses. So hopefully you can see this boat. Yeah, you can see it. This is, and it's armed with like a missile. So see here, see this? That's what's on those ships. This is extremely dangerous. So that's why, even though Donald Trump said, okay, because London said they were either not going to insure, or the insurance was going to go up 5 times over wartime rates. And Donald Trump opened up opportunities with other insurers that are American based that wouldn't make those high of rates, but the ships still weren't going through. And this is why, because they're concerned about these little tiny boats with missiles on them. Okay, so I'd have to get an update on what all is happening with that, but several commercial ships have been damaged in incidents linked to the conflict. Iran has warned ships associated with the United States and allied countries about operating in the strait. The U.S. has increased naval presence in the region and is considering additional security measures for commercial shipping. Oil infrastructure concerns. Energy infrastructure has become one of the main strategic concerns in the conflict. Recent developments include drone and missile strikes targeting oil and gas facilities in the Gulf region. Damage reported at energy storage sites and fuel depots connected to regional supply networks. Attacks near major refining and export infrastructure. Analysts say energy infrastructure is a high-value strategic target because disrupting oil supply can pressure global markets and governments. Statements from U.S. leadership. President Donald Trump has said the United States has the capacity or the capability to sustain operations, and that the conflict could continue for several weeks if necessary. Trump has also stated the U.S. will ensure the free flow of energy to the world, including the possibility of naval escorts for oil tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. officials say their current objectives is degrading Iran's military capabilities and preventing further missile attacks by Iranian forces and regional proxy groups. So here's the thing. There were no missile attacks on all the, whatever, I don't care. Statement from other officials. Secretary Marco Rubio warned the conflict could enter a more severe phase if attacks on energy infrastructure continue. So I guess Israel maybe like striked. It sounds like Israel because then the United States today I saw came out and said like, hey, don't be like hitting Iran's oil infrastructure because we need it for when when all this is done, Iran has to be able to be an independent state. But what they really mean is don't hit their infrastructure because now they're hitting all the oil infrastructure all in the Gulf countries. They targeted tons and tons of oil infrastructure over the last couple of days, and it's actually pretty bad. Several Gulf state governments have expressed concern about the impact of continued strikes on desalination plants, ports, and energy facilities. So they also struck an Iranian desalination plant, which then led them to start attacking all the desalination plants in the Gulf countries, the Gulf states. And these are extremely important. This is how they get water to villages way out and about. They have all these desalination plants. And so this could have really affect the civilian population very negatively if in the Gulf states and in Iran, nobody can get fresh water. Regional leaders have warned that the damage to these systems could threaten water supplies, fuel availability, and economic stability. And so one of the things that people are worried about is that the Gulf countries have a lot of money invested in certain things in America, certain things, companies that are just starting out, like AI and stuff like that. They've invested very heavily. And if they now have to pull all that money out because they have to rebuild all this damage in their countries and their economy's all messed up because the oil, that's how they make a lot of their economy, has halted and has been damaged, etc., then they pull out of the AI companies and stuff like that, and then that AI bubble pops, and then that causes a lot of issues. So there's actually a lot of stuff people are talking about, secondary and third and fourth consequences to this whole issue right now. Regional leader, okay, I read that. Global economic concerns. Economic impacts are already emerging as markets react to the conflict. Oil markets. Oil prices have surged above 100 per barrel amid fears of supply disruption. So this has actually been leveled out again as of like the time of this writing. It had gotten up to like 119. But Donald Trump actually released the sanctions on Russian oil. So that made the oil price go back down to about 80 something a barrel. So Russia is now going to be able to sell its oil to whoever wants to buy it at a premium. A bunch of analysts are saying that this is going to, any gaps that they had in their budget, this is going to completely fill. Just the situation alone is going to fill all the gaps in their budget for this year. Analysts warn prices could rise significantly higher if tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted. Global markets. Stock markets in several regions declined sharply as investors reacted to geopolitical risk and energy market instability. Inflation risks. Economists warn sustained energy price increases could push global inflation higher and slow economic growth. Energy prices affect transportation, manufacturing, food production, and supply chains worldwide. And it's not just that, it's out of the Strait of Hormuz, a lot of fertilizer comes out of there, chemicals needed for fertilizer and stuff. So that's going to affect agriculture really bad. All this is going to have negative effects all the way down the line. And I don't know if this was all taken into account because it doesn't appear like it was. Now, I could be completely wrong. I certainly don't know, anything about what the government knows and what they had planned. But it just doesn't seem like that was what they had planned, because why didn't they have these things already in place? Like, why didn't they have because they're having to bring in more in interceptors from other countries, like in the south, like in the Asian area and stuff. Like they took some out of South Korea to bring over and stuff like that. And then they lost two of their radars for their THAAD missile interceptors, which are extremely rare. There's only maybe 13 to 20 worldwide, and they lost two of them. And they're extremely hard to make and extremely hard to maybe they can be repaired. I'm not really for sure, but then they're bringing in more from that they have around the world. And it's like, wouldn't you have already had them there? I mean, so I just feel like some things so another thing that I think is weird is, why would they unreleasing Russia's sanctions? I'm sure they didn't plan on doing that. What's the other? There's a bunch of stuff that's just, it doesn't seem like there were plans put in place for this. I had it in my mind, but I lost it. Oh, so you know how in Iran or in Ukraine, Ukrainians have been fighting with Russia, right? And so Russia uses these exact kamikaze drones that Iran's using because Iran makes them and Russia buys them for the war. So the Ukraine government or military has gotten really effective at learning how to shoot these type of drones down because they've been fighting it for this amount of time. And so they're actually bringing in specialists from the Ukraine to teach the Gulf states how to shoot down these particular type of kamikaze drones. So you would have thought that they would have already done, you know what I'm saying? It just, okay, so now we have to rush in. Oh, we need Britain to like bring in some of their fighting jets and like help intercept these things. And we need this country. And it's like, was all this planned? Because none of these people seem to know that this is what was going to be happening. The Gulf states say they weren't given any warning about all this. Now they're being struck over and over again by Iran. We're bringing in specialists from Ukraine to help with the drone shooting down. People are going to be going without water in the region now. So it's just, there's first order consequences, right, to things. And I think they thought that through. But then the second, third, fourth, fifth order consequences, it seems like, but I don't know. I could be completely wrong. Okay, summary. The last 48 hours of the conflict have been defined by continued military strikes on both sides, escalating threats to oil infrastructure, disruptions to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, rising concern about global energy supply and economic stability, and the situation remains highly fluid as both military operations and economic impacts continue to develop. Okay, so here's a casualty update. So Iran, 1,200 to 1,330 plus killed, military and civilians combined. Okay, so, and then Israel, 15 deaths, 13 civilians and 2 soldiers, 2,072 civilians injured, 14 soldiers injured. Most casualties occurred during Iranian missile barrages targeting major cities and infrastructure. United States, total deaths 7 service members, at least 9 seriously wounded, and about at least 9 seriously injured, and around 20 total wounded. Kuwait, 2 Kuwaiti Navy personnel killed, 2 Kuwaiti border guards killed, 32 civilians injured, 67 soldiers injured. Bahrain, 1 civilian shipyard worker killed, 2 U.S. Defense Department employees injured. Saudi Arabia, 2 civilians killed, 12 injured. Strait of Hormuz, 8 seafarers were killed, multiple tanker crew members injured, several commercial vessels damaged. Pakistan, 10 to 16 protesters killed, 60 plus injured during clashes with security forces. Okay, so this is the thing. There are separatist groups and militia groups that support Iran in every single one of these Gulf state countries. There's Shia Muslim populations in every one of these Gulf state countries. There, and even in Turkey, Pakistan. You know, Pakistan is on the border with Afghanistan. They have problems along their border and stuff like that. So this whole conflict is causing people are uprising within the Gulf states to attack the Gulf state governments that are pro-Iranian separatists. So that's what I mean by powder keg. You know what I mean? Like you start dropping bombs there and it could just turn into a vast variety of conflicts across the whole place. So estimated injuries, 2,000 plus injured across the region. So about 1,400-ish plus, 1,380 plus people killed. And that, I'm sure it's grown by now, but that's what it was. So this is my post on the school strike. This whole school thing, it really bothers me because, of course, whoever did it, it wasn't on purpose, right? Like nobody targeted the school on purpose, but the way people are describing this whole situation just kind of irks me. This situation happened, like it was reported, like we know when it happened. It happened when Israel and the US came in on that really hard, heavy sortie. That's exactly when it happened, when they targeted these military installations in the certain area where the school was. And so then there was a video online circulating online showing like a missile like messing up and hitting the school, but then that was debunked. And then people were saying that Iran took responsibility for it. Are you insane? No, they have never taken responsibility for it, nor would they ever do something. You think Iran is, even if they were the ones who did it, we're going to take responsibility for it when they could blame the US or Israel? Are you serious? Like, no, they never took responsibility for that. That's literally insane to say that. Okay? So these things take investigation. So coming right out in the very beginning and saying for sure it's blah, blah, blah is literally insanity, because they have to be able to investigate the site, etc., etc. And there's all kinds of ways that people do stuff like that. Okay? Here's my reporting on that as of 2 days ago or whatever. Okay, so this happened on February 28th. Location, blah, blah, blah. I can't say it. Girls Elementary School in Manab province in Iran. So context, occurred during the opening phase of the U.S.-Israeli strikes against Iranian military targets. Reported casualties, Iranian authorities claim roughly 160 to 180 killed, majority children. Exact numbers remain unverified due to restricted access and internet blackouts. So that number may not be correct. We don't know. Geolocation event verification. Videos and photos of the destroyed school were geolocated and verified by multiple international outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters, CNN, and ABC News. Satellite imagery confirms the destruction of the school complex and surrounding structures. Impact patterns show multiple precision strikes within the same compound area. Proximity to military infrastructure. The school sits adjacent to the IRGC naval facility in Manab. Okay, so this is a place they were specifically targeting, the United States and Israel. Okay? This was a compound area where they were targeting specific military installations, infrastructure. Satellite imagery shows the school located extremely close to buildings associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. Analysts assess that the U.S. strikes targeting the IRGC naval site occurred at the same time window. And like I was watching all this, this was the time window. Okay? Weapons, evidence, and strike analysis. Verified video footage circulating online and analyzed by, so this was shared online by Iranian outlets, and then it was analyzed by international media and weapons experts, appears to show a Tomahawk cruise missile striking the vicinity of the IRGC facility near the school. Tomahawk missiles are primarily used by the United States forces and were confirmed to be a part of the opening strike campaign. Satellite analysis suggests precision air-to-surface munitions consistent with coordinated military targeting rather than a random missile failure. So, like, what's that saying? What that is saying is that analysts are looking at the debris of the school, and it doesn't look like how it would look with a missile failure. So if you saw that video of a missile just kind of like spiraling down, it wouldn't hit the building the way a tomahawk would come down and hit it that way, because it wouldn't hit it exactly right. It would be like off. You know what I mean? It's spiraling and it's not at as high speed. Attribution claims. Iran blames the United States and Israel, calling the strike a war crime and accusing them of attacking civilian infrastructure. So, but that's the thing. They didn't purposely do this. If they did, because we still don't know. Like, we have no idea. This video could be false for all we know. We're just going off what people are analyzing the images and the videos. Okay, and the timing. But so if they did do it, they weren't targeting that place because it was a school. They didn't know it was a school. It would have been for faulty intelligence. Maybe that building wasn't always used as a school. Maybe it was just recently started being used as a school. So they would have had intelligence that it wasn't a school. They didn't actually do this because it was a school. You know what I mean? So that has to be also, like, you have to think logically about things. The U.S. officials state the U.S. does not intentionally target civilian sites and say the incident is under investigation. Some U.S. officials speaking to media outlets indicate internal assessments suggest a U.S. munition may have been responsible, possibly due to a targeting error or collateral damage during the strike on a nearby IRGC facility. I don't think it was like just collateral damages and debris. It looks like it was hit by a missile. Because I've seen the pictures of the debris and of the building, but it would still be collateral damage because they didn't mean to hit that building, or they didn't mean for it to hit a building that was a school. You know what I mean? Alternative claims circling. Hold on. The White House and President Trump have publicly denied direct responsibility for hitting the school and suggested the possibility of an Iranian missile misfire. Well, now I saw a video, maybe I can find it, I don't know, but I saw Trump say, well, America's not the only one with tomahawks. It might have been an outside country that hit them. There was no outside country firing into Iran when you and Israel were doing that first initial run of hitting them really hard, coming in and just unleashing. There were no, that doesn't even make sense. So yeah, the whole thing is just I don't know. Just take responsibility if it was you, or just say you're continuing to investigate it, you know? Early social media claims suggested an Iranian missile malfunction originating from nearby IRGC facilities. These claims remain unsubstantiated. Fact checks and reporting note that Iran has not admitted to any misfire and has consistently blamed U.S.-Israeli strikes. International response. UN bodies and international organizations condemned the strike and called for an independent investigation. These organizations have not formally assigned responsibility. Current evidence assessment, verified video analysis, satellite imagery, strike timing relative to U.S. operations, weapons identification by munitions experts. Together with these lines of evidence strongly suggest a U.S. munition was responsible, most likely as collateral damage during a strike targeting the adjacent IRGC naval facility. Some analysts are saying it could have to do with incorrect or outdated intelligence of what that building was being used for. No official has admitted responsibility for striking the school itself. The U.S. investigation is ongoing. The full circumstances remain under review and may change as additional evidence emerges. So we do not know who did the strike. We do not know. Saying that it was Iran, that it was a misfire. We do not know. We do not know. This is the fog of war. People make fake stuff. People say fake things all the time. We do not know. It is under investigation. We might not ever know because nobody might ever take responsibility for it. This was interesting. So this is ordered from highest to number of projectiles launched toward each country so far. So the United Arab Emirates, 1,422 drones, 246 missiles, total 1,668 projectiles. Most were intercepted by Emirati air defenses. Major targets included air bases, ports, and energy infrastructure. Kuwait, 406 drones, 219 missiles, total projectiles 625. Many attacks targeted U.S. military installations and Kuwaiti bases hosting coalition forces. Qatar, 63 drones, 129 missiles, total projectiles 192. Targets reportedly include the region around Al-Udeid Air Base, one of the largest military facilities in the Middle East. Bahrain, 164 drones, 95 missiles. Total projectiles 259. Strikes included attacks near the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters as well as infrastructure and refinery areas. Israel, exact numbers are less publicly reported due to security restrictions. So estimated 200 plus ballistic missiles and multiple drone waves. So I watch the war channels on Telegram, and it is just drone attack after drone attack and missile attack on Israel. So they should actually, I feel like, be number one on the list, but they're not telling us about it. But then the videos, there's sirens going off constantly. There's maps where all the missiles are coming towards on the Telegram war places. There's footage of when they don't shoot them down and stuff like that. So, but they're just not allowing it to be reported for whatever reason. Saudi Arabia, total unknown, cleared due to interception reporting differences. Known incidents include multiple missile launches toward eastern oil facilities, drone strikes targeting energy infrastructure and diplomatic sites. Several projectiles were intercepted by Saudi air defenses. Jordan, attacks include missile launches toward U.S. military facilities, several drone incursions intercepted by Jordanian defenses. Exact totals remain unclear. Oman, small number of drone strikes reported. Attacks targeted port and nearby shipping lanes. Iraq, multiple rocket and drone attacks on U.S. facilities, strikes near bases in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan. So 500 missiles launched across the whole area and 2,000 drones launched, supposedly, allegedly. I bet it's a lot higher than that. They're using cluster ones too now on Israel. So Israel will go to intercept and then it'll spread apart because it's a cluster munition. And so then some of the cluster will get through. So I've seen some footage of that. Let's see if I've saved anything interesting. So this Iranian military official said that they are prepared for 10 years of war with the United States. At least 10 years. Who knows? I mean, they've had decades to prepare. People are saying that's not true. This crazy a-hole, Lindsey Graham, just saying, oh, we're going to make a ton of money off this. This is going to be great for, America, because once we're done with this, we're going to make a bunch of money. So this Promethean action, I wanted to make a video where I go through all the different theories about why this is happening. So this Promethean action, they're all saying that this is to break the British empire hold on the global governance. That's their theory, and a couple others.
On Friday, President Donald Trump demanded unconditional surrender from Iran. His enemies have seized on that statement to sow panic, predicting a new economic blowout, which will deliver the midterm elections for the Democrats. Here's Carolyn Levitt explaining war to the jackals in the media.
President Trump means when he says unconditional surrender is when he, as commander-in-chief of the United States military and the leader of the free world, determines that Iran can no longer pose a threat to the United States of America and to our troops and our personnel in the Middle East. We're already well on our way to achieving the objectives of Operation Epic Fury, and when the president determines that Iran no longer poses that threat, that's when that unconditional surrender will take place.
Now, the City of London's financial press are showing financial panic, claiming that we're headed for a 1979-style oil shock, once again caused by events in Iran, if the war isn't stopped immediately. Bloomberg News on Friday said that $100 oil is just about here. The Wall Street Journal this morning carries the headline, America braces for oil shock as Iran war throttles supply. And the Financial Times leads by asking, is the nightmare scenario for energy finally here? The lead anti-Trump economist Paul Krugman gleefully predicts the same gas lines, rationing, and stagflation that America experienced from the Iran oil shock in 1979. They're all wrong, and their evil intentions are very clear. That oil shock was not the product of market forces, and neither is the panic they're trying to create today. I'm Barbara Boyd, and I'm going to prove it to you because I've studied the imperial gray game for decades, including the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the oil shock it caused. What the globalists want is simple, an economic crisis they can pin on Trump to deliver the House and Senate in the midterm elections. And once again, the mullahs are their instrument, just like 1979. Here's what I'm going to cover today. First, what the 1979 oil shock actually was, who built it, and why. Second, how the same playbook is being run today against Trump's American economic renaissance. And third, why unconditional surrender of the Khomeini regime is not the cause of economic chaos. It is the cure. Let's get into it. But first, hit the like button and share this video. It increases our reach on YouTube. To understand why they destroyed Iran in 1979, you have to understand what Iran was becoming and how it defied the globalist plans. By the mid-1970s, the Shah of Iran was using oil wealth to build a modern industrial nation, and he was moving very fast. Over 30 nuclear power plants were under construction or in planning with France and West Germany. So too, a massive steel industry. His explicit goal was to make Iran one of the world's top industrial powers, independent, sovereign, no longer dependent on raw material exports. And it wasn't just Iran. France and Germany were laying the groundwork for a new international monetary system that would reform the IMF and finance industrial development across the entire developing world. For British Petroleum and the Anglo-American financial establishment that had controlled Iran's oil since the 1950s, this was an existential threat. The Council on Foreign Relations had already mapped out the future world economy in their Project 1980s project commencing in 1975. They called for a complete halt to exactly this type of industrial development, starting right here in the United States. It became the Carter administration's policies. Just listen to their own words. A degree of controlled disintegration in the world economy is a legitimate objective for the 1980s and may be the most realistic one for a moderate international economic order. Controlled disintegration. That was the policy, and they had the perfect weapon to deliver a major blow. They overthrew the Shah by weaponizing his fatal flaw, the Sabak, his brutal secret police, trained by MI6, the CIA, and the Israelis. The Sabak made Iran an easy target for a worldwide human rights campaign. And the Muslim Brotherhood, a tool of British intelligence going back to the 1920s, was deployed to run the color revolution that brought the Shah down. When Khomeini took power, he canceled every modernization project, the nuclear plants, the steel mills, all of it, denouncing them as, quote, Western and, quote, anti-Islamic. The resulting oil shock caused by the supply disruptions from Iran and panic chatter in the financial press shattered the economies of France, Germany, and the United States. And it worked exactly as they planned it. The City of London's banks profited from the speculative oil spot market and the control of insurance and settlements on all energy and raw materials throughout the world. The City of London engineered the crisis and they cashed in on it. That is the history they don't teach. It's what we do at Promethean Action every single week. You can get ahead of events by subscribing to our free newsletter. And if you're already subscribed, you might have already thought about the fact that this is the same enemy playbook being run now. It's just a different decade. So now you know what happened in 1979. The question is, why are we talking about it today? Well, it's because the same people, the same institutions, the same imperial establishment that engineered the controlled disintegration of 1979 are running the identical playbook against Donald Trump's economic revolution right now in the United States. Their calculation is straightforward. Iran's counterattacks on Gulf oil infrastructure create a new oil shock. The economic crisis delivers democratic victories in the midterms. And Trump's economic renaissance, well, it dies in the cradle. When Trump came back into office, he came in with an explicit program. Tariffs to rebuild manufacturing, energy dominance to drive down costs, deregulation to unleash industrial investment, and a sovereign wealth fund to finance national development. He revived Hamilton's American system, the very system that the CFR's Project 1980s attacked by name. The parallels to what the Shah was attempting are not coincidental, but there is a very critical difference. Trump's program puts the prosperity and security of the American worker at the absolute center of everything, not Wall Street, not the globalists, the worker. His national security strategy says it plainly. American policy will be pro-worker, not merely pro-growth, and it will prioritize our own workers here. And Trump is the first president since Roosevelt who is unafraid to exercise the power of our unique American heritage. He knows exactly whose shoulders he's standing on. Here he is, right after the war started, pausing at the statues of Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson he has recently installed outside the White House. What are the objectives for Iran? While the globalist press screamed about oil shocks and stagflation, the President of the United States was standing with the men who built the most powerful economy in history out of a post-Revolutionary War bankruptcy. That is not a coincidence. Our oil and natural gas supplies are at a peak based on Trump's policies, and we have taken steps to use our own programs to ensure ships going through the Straits of Hormuz, and we've offered naval escorts. There is absolutely no real reason for an oil shock precisely because of Trump's policies. Trump also came in with an explicit security doctrine and open borders and the drug trade, exit the permanent wars, and prioritize our own hemisphere. The Middle East was not explicitly a major security target. That's the first time that's been that way in years. But the red lines were clear for the Middle East. Gulf energy must not fall to an outright enemy. The Strait of Hormuz must remain open. The region must not export terror against America. And Israel must remain secure. Iran with a nuclear weapon hits every one of those red lines simultaneously. Not one voice in the anti-war chorus will tell you the regime Trump is destroying was a British intelligence installation. Not one will tell you the 1979 oil shock was deliberate economic warfare. Not one will mention the controlled disintegration of the economy because they were for it then and they are for it now. The difference between 1979 and 2026 is one man, and they know it. So let's bring this home. The CFR, the economists, the Wall Street economists, the anti-war crowd, they all agree. Trump must stop, negotiate, accept a ceasefire, because if he doesn't, economic catastrophe follows. They have it exactly backwards. The Khomeini regime was installed in 1979 as a permanent weapon against the American and world economy. It was designed to do exactly what it is doing right now: threaten the Strait of Hormuz, attack Gulf energy infrastructure, weaponize oil against the West. That is not a side effect of the mullahs' ideology. That is their primary function. And that's what they were built to do. The cure is not a ceasefire. The cure is unconditional surrender. Think about what the day after looks like. Iran sits on the third largest proven oil reserves on earth. Under the mullahs, those reserves have been deliberately withheld and weaponized. A post-Khomeini Iran, under a government aligned with its own people's interests, doesn't just stop being a threat. It becomes one of the world's great energy producers. Its intellectuals and professionals who fled the mullahs' prosecutions returned to help build their nation. A Middle East that is developing and prospering does not produce terrorism. It does not weaponize oil. It does not serve as the British Empire's permanent destabilization instrument. That is Trump's actual strategic vision. And when you understand it, the entire manufactured globalist financial panic makes perfect sense. They're not worried about the American economy. They're worried about their own survival. In 2026, the man in the White House is finishing what the CFR started in 1979, but in reverse. He is not disintegrating. He is rebuilding. And a major step in that rebuilding is removing the weapon they installed 47 years ago. Unconditional surrender is not the cause of economic chaos. It is the cure.
Okay, so so I find their analysis really interesting. It's much different than a lot of other analysts that are out there. Okay, so let's look at, so Brian Berletic is a really great analyst. He is not pro-American really, but like he looks at a lot of the stuff that America is doing all around the world as very much a war of aggression on America. So he comes at it from that angle. People claiming Israel controls the U.S. are either delusional or dishonest. The U.S. in particular has been exterminating indigenous populations, stealing land, and pilfering resources for nearly 200 years before Israel ever existed. So, like, like I said, he's not super pro America's wars at all, okay? How is what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East any different than what it did to the indigenous people of American Midwest? Western civilization has been doing it for centuries beforehand. The British Empire for well over 2 centuries before the Rothschilds. Western civilization was for centuries bent on brutal racist empire building, and it continues today. Israel is just one of many cogs it created perpetuating this process. The idea that Israel somehow got the ruthless, raceless thieves running the U.S. to bend a knee to them is an absurdity in the face of value, almost as absurd as imagining the West was previously ran by honorable men at one point only to be hijacked by Israel. There is the material reality of Wall Street, arms, oil, tech, pharma, etc., spending vastly greater sums on lobbying than AIPAC and all other Israeli lobbying combined. Wall Street being dominated today, just like it has always been, by white, nominally Christian males. The only thing worse than a Western civilization crumbling under its own rapacious induced rot is trying to blame others for it, attempting to cite the symptom rather than the sickness. This ensures that the sickness is never noticed, let alone treated, and to whose benefit? The sickness. The U.S. can continue existing as a rapacious empire with or without Israel. It surely did fine for almost 2 centuries before Israel was created out of thin air by the Anglo-Americans, but the crimes of Israel would be impossible without the U.S. empire behind it. Israel is not blameless. Blame it for its role in facilitating Western empire up to and including abetting genocide and wars of aggression, but do not blame it for corrupting something that was never wholesome to begin with. Now, do I agree with that? No. Normally he's not so bombastic, but I think he's like really tired of the we're all doing this for Israel shouting. So I think that's why that's a little aggressive. Like, I certainly think George Washington was a great and honorable man. He is by far my favorite person in history other than Jesus Christ. I adore George Washington. So this is his.
Today is March 10th, 2026. This is now the 11th day of the U.S. war of aggression launched against Iran. We're approaching the 12th day mark. That will be tomorrow. Please remember, I'm located in Southeast Asia. I'm 12 hours ahead. And so if the time and date isn't matching up exactly for you, that is the reason why. But we're nearing the 12th.
Just so everybody knows, like he is, I believe he's used to be a Marine. So he has served in the United States military. And so he has a lot of really good analysis on the way military operates, especially around the world. And so that's why I like listening to him. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but he's very knowledgeable on many things.
Day mark. And why is the 12th day mark significant? Because that is the number of days the US launched a war of aggression against Iran just last year, around June. And so now we see a much larger war, much wider scale of death and destruction, both inside Iran and across the region as Iran retaliates against US military bases. And as the US and its proxies in the region strike critical civilian infrastructure, like desalination plants that provide fresh water for the Iranian population, Iran is forced to reciprocate and strike these sort of plants in countries that are hosting US military forces and who are allowing their territory to be used as a springboard to attack Iran. But this is the problem Iran has, and this is the problem Russia and China have. The United States is waging proxy war all around the world. Right now, it is waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. It is waging a proxy and now direct war against Iran through Israel, the Persian Gulf states, Jordan, and there's almost certainly other nations mixed in there that are not openly revealing their involvement here, but whose involvement I think will be forthcoming in the days and weeks ahead. Turkey, for example, also hosting US troops and almost certainly being used as a springboard to attack Iran directly, because it has been used as a springboard for years and years to wage the proxy wars the US used to encircle and contain Iran in the first place, to prepare the battlefield, in essence, for this war in the first place. And this goes all the way back to the so-called Arab Spring. And I just want to show people how extensively all of this was planned for. I hear so many people saying President Donald Trump has no plan. President Donald Trump is in charge of nothing. He makes no plans. He's a loud distraction and a liar who is just leading the American public and anyone in the global public foolish enough to listen along for the ride. I want to show you this article that I wrote all the way back in 2011. It was titled 2011, Year of the Dupe. Back then, I used to write under the pen name Tony Cartolucci. And my writing, I mean, this is when I really started writing often, was 2011 to cover the Arab Spring. And I was covering it because just the year before, here in Thailand, where I'm based, the US was backing opposition who did the exact same thing. They came out with armed militants, hiding amongst protesters. The US also organized and backed through the National Endowment for Democracy. They burned sections of Thailand's capital, Bangkok, to the ground. They killed soldiers, they killed police, they killed civilians. They even deliberately killed their own protesters with snipers in the exact same manner we saw during the Arab Spring and also during the Euromaidan in Ukraine and many other US-sponsored protests. So I had seen that firsthand, I witnessed it, and I was screaming from the top of the mountain trying to warn people that this is how the US does business, and they have a big plan where all of this is leading to. And I just want to, not going to read the whole thing, it's very long. The link will be in the video description below.
Now, I will say, like, that is 100% true. I do not like this whole idea that we all have to, like, all be neocons now all of a sudden. Like, it's very strange to me. I have been covering on my channel the CIA coups and color revolutions that they do all the time throughout all these other countries that should be sovereign. I am a conservative. I believe in sovereignty, and that means sovereignty of nations. I believe in that each nations are sovereign, just like I believe that of our own nation. I don't like that the left tries to tell us what to do and that we have to like change everything about our country and we have to tear down all our statues and all that. But then I'm supposed to be okay with it happening to other countries with our government's intervention, meddling and stuff like that to get people to turn against their own governments and their own what's best for them and their country, like they did in Ukraine, like they have done in many other places. Okay, we're reading the book Provoked on my channel by Scott Horton, who is a libertarian, and I don't know what he's saying about Iran right now, but I guarantee you it's probably very similar to this guy's analysis. Okay, this stuff is actually happening. So like what he just said about how they're doing this all over the world, but then they blame the countries they're doing this against as the aggressors, that is 100% true.
You can go and check it out. And what I do is I show the timeline, how years and years in advance the US was preparing the battlefield for this Arab Spring and also the US wars that followed it. And I explained how the US was doing this in Europe. And I also explained how the US was gathering together all of these opposition groups, funding them, equipping them, training them. We have this video here from Hillary Clinton all the way back in 2009. Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton addresses Youth Movement Summit.
I want to congratulate all of you who have come to Mexico City in person and online to be part of this groundbreaking summit. You are the vanguard of a rising generation of citizen activists who are using the latest technological tools to catalyze change, build movements, and transform lives. And I hope this conference provides an opportunity for you to learn from each other and discover the tools and techniques that will open new doors for activism and empowerment when you return home.
And here's Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time, during the Obama administration, telling all of these activists that had been gathered together by the U.S., brought to the United States, brought to other locations in the collective West, to attend these annual workshops. And they did this for years before the Arab Spring began. And they were training them, they were equipping them. The participants weren't just the US State Department, but it was also Facebook and Google and Twitter. And they were laying the groundwork for the color revolution regime change model that the US now regularly uses to steamroll across the entire planet. And they created regional instability starting in 2011 to prepare the ground for regime change wars in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen. And all of this was ultimately aimed at Iran. And we know that. And we know that they didn't just begin preparing protesters to start the unrest. They were also preparing militants. This is from the New Yorker, 2007, the redirection by Seymour Hersh. And I'm going to read this. The link will be in the video description. You can read the entire article. To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that's backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally, Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, have nothing to do with Sunni Islam. It is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all of these other organizations, terrorist organizations that use a politically perverted version of Islam to create a proxy force the U.S. can use as a pretext to invade a country. They can say, Al-Qaeda is located in there, and we have to go in there and get them out. And essentially, they're just using it as an excuse to invade that country. That is exactly what they did in terms of Syria. They also use it as a proxy force to fight the government itself. And that is also exactly what they did in Syria. That is also what they did in Libya. So they're using it as a pretext and as a proxy. A pretext to invade countries where the U.S. wants its military forces to be deployed, and also as a proxy to fight where U.S. forces cannot go. And that was all the way back in 2007. When we see headlines like this now, this month, as the U.S. is waging this war of aggression against Iran, CIA working to arm Kurdish forces to spark uprising in Iran, sources say. Trump calls Kurdish leaders in Iran war efforts. Or we have been preparing why the boots on the ground in Iran could be Kurdish. And I'm trying to warn people that this is not some plan that they are just coming up with right now. In order to conduct a ground operation into a well-defended country, you prepare months, if not years in advance. This force was already prepared. It was likely in preparation as Syria was collapsing, as the U.S. was already under the Biden administration preparing for this war now being carried out by the Trump administration, or at least under the Trump administration. So if there is a ground force to go into Iran, it was already prepared and it is simply waiting. Stop allowing them to use political theater to divide and distract people over what's going to happen. If they have the intention to go in on the ground, they already have a force prepared well in advance. Now, I want to show you all of my mentions of China. I'm explaining all of the preparations for the Arab Spring in 2011 years in advance. And I say, as we will see, preparations for the Arab Spring and the global campaign that is now encroaching on both Russia and China, and I predicted this in another 2011 article all the way back in February, actually, began not as unrest had already begun, but years before the first fist was raised. And within seminar rooms in DC and New York, US-funded training facilities in Serbia and camps held in neighboring countries, not within the Arab world itself. I have a map here showing the destabilization, and I mentioned, again, this is all the way back in 2011. US-backed destabilization is in red. Blue, US-occupied countries, or countries that are politically captured by the US. China's oil and sea access to the Middle East and Africa are being, or have already been cut. A similar strategy of isolation was used on Japan just before the onset of World War II. So I was warning people that the ultimate goal of this isn't a greater Israel, because the U.S. has been captured and is a puppet of Israel. The point of all of this was to rearrange the entire Middle East, eliminate Iran, control all of the oil in the region, and cut it off from China. And if the U.S. was successful in doing that back then, China would have been in real big trouble. And China knew this. And China, for many, many years, has been working hard. People say, what is China doing? China's been working hard for years to protect itself from being cut off by exactly this plan. They knew that this was coming. We remember, as the Arab Spring was destroying the Arab world, U.S. politicians openly saying Russia and China would be next. And I included this map showing the lines of communication from the Middle East to China. I talked about cutting these lines in the Asia-Pacific region, but then also you can see this, the source of all these hydrocarbons is right here, the Strait of Hormuz. I also talked about NATO expansion up to and along Russia's border. This was before 2014. I was warning people that this was also headed towards Russia. And look here, Ukraine was one of the last places it had to spread, and it was spreading there. That brings us to today. People are focused, laser focused on the conflict between the US and Iran. Is the US going to run out of precision guided munitions or air defense systems or not? Is Iran going to run out of ballistic missile launchers and ballistic missiles themselves? Is their internal security going to hold? And these are all legitimate concerns to have. I've expressed them myself. But there is a bigger picture at play here. And I want to share with you some of the posts that I've posted since my last video update. And this one in particular, the US war on Iran is a US war on China. I'm going to read through this, and I hope people see the bigger picture here and look out beyond the region to what the US ambition really is here. US planners likely realized, as a result of attrition in its proxy war on Russia and considering the outcome of the ongoing war with Iran in the Middle East, that even a distant blockade in the Asia-Pacific against China was unlikely to succeed. And I've talked about this for many, many years. This is a 2018 paper, but it's one of many spanning many years. A maritime oil blockade against China, and they have a map right here. And they're showing all of the choke points that they hope the US military could impose to stop shipping coming and going from China, especially oil. And they would use the US Marine Corps, who would, under the previous Biden administration, be reconfigured.
So I just want to say that, how can I say this? I want to say that I find it really gross and just not cool that we want every other country to just be stomped into the ground. They can never be capable of anything great. They can never have a good economy, because in reality, what you're doing, if you're cutting off China to the rest of the world, you're making it to where the country's going to be poorer. And that's the same thing for like Africa. That's the same thing for wanting all these countries destabilized in the Middle East. All this stuff, when you are doing this kind of stuff, then you're basically saying to the people that live there that they have to remain poor and trodden down forever, because they're never allowed to better themselves and pull themselves out of what we consider third world. You know what I mean? Like, I don't understand why we're like that. So China's not allowed to get oil from anyone. China's not allowed to trade with anyone. China's not allowed to do any of this stuff because we don't want them to threaten our dominance over the world. I just think it's like a really sick, unchristian, immoral way to live, or a mindset to have towards other countries. It just is crazy to me. I think that people should have the sovereign ability to trade with one another. I'm sort of like an anti-federalist constitutionalist. So if you read the anti-federalist papers, they were saying things like, how dare you say I can't trade my wool to some person across the seas to, you know, so it's a very open, like, I'm rambling, but I just find this kind of stuff like unsavory. Like, I just feel like, why can't we move on and be friends? Like, it's not World War II. It's not the Cold War. Why can't we just move on? And maybe that is what they're doing in the Middle East. Maybe the plan has shifted and he's just still thinking about it in the way that it was, because this is true. Like, what he's saying is true. Like, we all know what they did in these wars in like 2023 and all the money that or 2003 and all the money that they made and how they kept it going forever and ever and ever, and how well, I guess people don't know, because I still hear people say China's a threat, Russia's a threat. One of the other weird things I hear people say is that China is an empire, like they want to spread out. Like, no, they will isolate themselves. There are periods of time where China just completely isolated themselves, and they have spread out, like, in their area. It's like, can we not ever move out of this mindset that we have to constantly have just an enemy to fight? Like, why can't we just be really strong, have a really good military that's capable of whatever? We can still invest into it. I'm not saying, yes, neocons, invest. Like, let's invest in it constantly. You could take it and you could just blow the equipment up into the ocean if you want, so that you can order more or something. But why can't we just move on from this weird mindset? And I'm not saying we should trust all these countries or whatever. And I certainly don't like Iran's government. But I'm just saying, like, in general, I'm just like, we're just doing an overview. We're just listening to several different analysts, people saying different things, okay? And I'm like the type of person where I don't just settle on like one thing. I like to listen to a variety of topics and mull over things in my head for a long time.
Into a uniquely and almost entirely anti-shipping missile force, specifically to interdict Chinese shipping. And they were supposing that these choke points are far enough away from China's military capabilities that they would be able to impose this, and China would be able to do very little about it. Back in 2018, this was what they were thinking. Since 2018, we can see how quickly China has been moving in all regards in terms of its industrial base, technology, military power, things like artificial intelligence, even energy independence. They saw the window of opportunity closing very rapidly. China is about 85% or more energy independent. However, a huge amount of the energy that they still need to import comes from the Middle East. And they have about a 5-year window, the United States, before China is able to cut that out as well. They are working on it. That is their central goal in terms of energy independence, is eliminating pressure points the US could apply to cripple or collapse the Chinese economy. This is existential for China. People are wondering, why doesn't China just drop everything that it's doing and go send its whole military to Iran? Other than the fact that that's physically impossible because you need to have a military configured for traveling around the world with all the related logistical support. The fact that it doesn't have that and can't physically do that, it is also facing an existential threat right now. The United States, by launching this war of aggression against Iran, has now cut all Middle Eastern energy exports going to China. And now China has a 100-day reserve that they are running off of before they run out. And then they're going to have to face the consequences of just missing that percentage of their overall energy needs. It's somewhere around 10, some people say as high as 20% of their overall energy needs. Degrading or toppling Iran was already a prerequisite to further isolating both Russia and then China. Thus, attacking Iran and shutting down energy exports from the entire region, no matter the cost, has effectively implemented the distant blockade on China at the very source of most of China's energy imports. So instead of doing this in Asia Pacific, they have now done this right here. Instead of cutting the arrow over here, they have cut the arrow over here. That is what they have done. This is what the United States is doing. And they're doing it because they're out of time. China is advancing and rising too quickly. The US is not keeping up. And so this is their last chance. It's a closing window. 5 years is not a long time in terms of geopolitics. This is their last chance to do this. At the same time, the US continues expanding its international blockade against the so-called Shadow Fleet through maritime drone strikes attributed to Ukraine. We all know it's the CIA doing it. The New York Times admitted that. And the interdiction and seizure of vessels by US proxies. And in the case of Venezuela, by the US itself. So the US itself has interdicted seized ships.
So the thing that he just said there about Ukraine, so the CIA has been working with Ukraine to give them intelligence on how to hit specific places inside of Russia. And they actually hit the residence of Putin not too long ago, and it was a really big deal. And then Putin disappeared for like a couple of weeks afterwards, and Russia was definitely not happy about it. And people were talking about if that was an attempt to take Putin out. But then the CIA came out. There was this thing that came out where they basically admitted to it, but they said that they thought that was a different building or something, but it was one of his residences or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And so then they just basically admitted that they were helping Ukraine do that. And then Putin disappeared for like 3 weeks. So yeah, it's so that did happen.
Bringing energy to China. Europe, on behalf of the United States, is boarding and seizing ships transporting Russian energy exports. The US Central Intelligence Agency is targeting and destroying tankers carrying Russian energy exports in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, off the coast of West Africa so far, and this will only expand. It is expanding. The CIA, according to the New York Times, is also the one launching these long-range drone strikes deep into Russia to strike at Russian energy production itself. And the goal is not just to cripple Russia's economy, but it's also to prevent Russia from shipping energy exports to China, no matter what the route. They are well aware of the pipelines going from Russia to China. If they strike energy production at its source in Russia, there's nothing to transport through the pipelines. Now, whether they can ramp that up to a degree where it's
So they want Russia and China, the people who live there, to be without any energy. They are intentionally targeting their energy infrastructure, which is going to affect the civilians in that area or in those countries, and they do not care about them. And it will be the ones that are the poorest in the regions that are in the poorest, most outward rural areas that will be affected the worst by this type of a thing.
Significantly cripples both Russia and China. That is a separate issue. The fact is they are doing it, and they are constantly expanding this. This is obviously one of their priorities. The fact that they invaded Venezuela, kidnapped the president, and is holding the remaining government hostage, essentially telling them, you will do what we say or we will murder you. That's what President Donald Trump told Venezuela. If you don't do what we tell you, we will bomb you again. They're implying that they will kill whoever it is that is not doing what they told them to do. And so Venezuela is doing everything the U.S. is telling them to do. They have been politically captured. However you want to spin it or think about it, they have been politically captured. And they are cutting oil exports to China and sending it instead to the United States. So as you can see, there is a global oil blockade, a maritime oil blockade being imposed on China right now. They attacked Venezuela first to eliminate that. Now they've attacked Iran. They're working on permanently eliminating Iranian oil exports altogether to China. And at the same time, because of the war, the nature of the war itself, and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, whoever we want to blame that on, hydrocarbons are not flowing to China anymore. This attack on maritime shipping, energy shipping, this can be expanded to all kinds of maritime shipping at any time of America's choosing. They are incrementally expanding this. They will continue to expand it, and it could end up including all maritime shipping going to and from China, not just energy. Note that the U.S. invaded and captured Venezuela, halting energy exports to China in the lead up to the second war of aggression, targeting the majority of China's remaining energy imports from the Middle East. I already mentioned this. The U.S. CIA continues carrying out long-range drone strikes into Russia, targeting energy production, specifically to degrade both Russia's own economy and its ability to export significant amounts of energy to China. These operations will only continue to increase in scale and scope, with likely operations moving to target pipelines into China directly. This is already a war on China. I said the war on Iran is a war on China. This is already a war on China. It has been all along, and China is well aware of this. So is Russia. They understand that they're also under siege by the United States, and it is all part of essentially a U.S. war against multipolarism, but it is attacking the pillars of multipolarism, specifically China, Russia, even Iran to a certain degree. The U.S. is also carrying out terrorist strikes on China's Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in Pakistan and Myanmar, specifically striking at alternative routes for energy used to bypass a potential Asia-Pacific blockade. These type of attacks can be organized and directed at whatever infrastructure China attempts to use next to mitigate the U.S.-imposed shortages China now faces. They have a whole network in place in every single country to politically oppose Belt and Road Initiative projects and to physically attack them if necessary. This is a systematic global war to strangle China. China has prepared for this for years, building out a massive 100-day reserve and scaling up renewables, nuclear power, and coal to liquid energy production domestically. It will still likely take years to replace dependency on the Middle East, about 5 years, maybe 5 to 10 years. A closing window the U.S. knew was closing, prompting this reckless war of aggression now taking place. The U.S. has also built up and armed proxies in the Asia-Pacific region, including Japan, the Philippines, and the Chinese island province of Taiwan, not to beat China, just like with Ukraine. It is not to beat Russia, but to use long-range missiles, drones to strike and degrade domestic efforts to circumvent the U.S.-imposed blockade, such as striking refineries, data centers, energy infrastructure, etc., just as the U.S. uses Ukraine to do so against Russia, all while avoiding a direct confrontation with China itself. And again, we see the U.S. using Ukraine against Russia, fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. They do not care what happens to Ukraine. The U.S. uses Ukraine to strike at the energy grid of Russia. Russia strikes at America's energy grid. No, they strike at Ukraine's energy grid, and the U.S. couldn't care less. And the same thing is now taking place in the Middle East. The U.S. strikes a desalinization plant in Iran. It strikes back at a plant in Bahrain, and the U.S. couldn't care less. That is the whole point of having proxies. They are all disposable, and you're using them instead of taking on the damage and the cost yourself. The U.S. believes that rapid initiative can overcome the growing number of disadvantages the U.S. has created for itself and faces due to China's rapid rise, like modernization and surpassing of the U.S. in terms of industry, military, and technology. It hopes that its willingness to indulge in globally destabilizing war of aggression is greater than China and the rest of the multipolar world's ability to unite and meaningfully fight back. Nazi Germany had the exact same strategy. They saw the Soviet Union. They said, it's huge, it has so many people, it has so much potential. If we strike now, and our initiative is so fast, so strong, with so much momentum, we will just push them over before they have a chance to organize and fight back. This is our opportunity to do it. If we wait another couple of years, they will be too strong and we won't have any opportunity at all to do this. And then they did it, and then they calculated wrong, and they lost. And because of the Nazis, their toxic ideology, simply a strain of what infects all of the West, the United States, Great Britain at the time. These were all colonial powers invading, wiping out indigenous populations, stealing resources, stealing land. And the Nazis were infected by the same toxic ideology, and it ended up destroying Germany almost to the last brick. Well, this is repeating itself now with the United States, its invasions everywhere, from Venezuela to Iraq, Syria, Iran, bombing Yemen, toppling Libya.
I don't necessarily agree with that assessment of that type of history there, but you know, I have a way different outlook on history just in general than some people do.
And now this global attempt to strangle China directly. The U.S. also believes that the wars it has ignited across the planet will primarily destabilize Eurasia, leaving North America, just like during World War II, relatively insulated. And so far, that is true. Who can deny that? Look at what has happened to Ukraine and then the rest of Europe. And look at what is now happening to the entire Middle East, including Israel. They're being hit by ballistic missiles. They are losing people. They are losing infrastructure. What has the U.S. suffered so far in all of this? Russia and China know about all of this, and they have made their own plans. Only time will tell who planned better. Now, we've seen strikes carried out on energy production and storage in the Middle East, supposedly by Iran. Except Iran has denied this. They're not denying that they're hitting all of these other targets, but they are denying that they hit these energy production sites in places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The implication here is that
Well, I don't necessarily believe whatever they're saying, right?
the U.S. itself deliberately struck these sites, and then their Arab proxies used it as an excuse to cut off energy production and exports, specifically to lock in this blockade, this distant blockade.
I don't know if the US would have hit those targets like that. I mean, it makes sense to me that Iran would be doing it because Iran's trying to get pressure put on the United States through using the world by putting pressure on by targeting the oil infrastructure. That puts pressure on the rest of the world to put pressure on the United States. Iran is just trying to hold out as long as it possibly can and cause pressure, right? So I don't necessarily agree with that either.
On China. And China has already instituted emergency measures in response to this. They almost certainly realized that the energy is not going to begin to flow anytime soon. And as Alex and Alexander have repeatedly mentioned on the Duran, their daily videos they do individually and the videos that they do together, that it is not simply flipping on and off a switch. When you shut down energy production, it could take weeks or longer for it to restart. The U.S. has brought in additional aircraft carriers to the region. They are rotating in additional fighter planes, bombers. They intend to keep this going for at least another month, but probably longer than that. And if you understand the big picture, you will realize that it doesn't even really matter whether they win their war against Iran. As long as they keep the energy shut off to China, they're winning the much bigger war that they have always been fighting all along, as I warned people all the way back in 2011 when the Arab Spring sprung. Now I want to talk about this other aspect of this conflict. Axios, U.S. dismayed by Israel's Iran fuel strikes, sources say. This is absolute, utter nonsense. And anyone buying this needs to seriously reevaluate how they do analysis. Stop sifting through the political theater that is designed specifically to distract you and look at the material realities of everything that is happening. And I will explain. I did a post on this too. So I talk about U.S. claims dismay over Israeli strikes on Iranian fuel depots and why you shouldn't believe them. The U.S. has, in all military operations throughout its history, sought to exterminate all human life where and when possible, turning entire nations into failed states and inhibiting life for everyone, not just governments it targets. In Serbia, it targeted the power grid, which is an irony because now they're complaining about Russia doing this to Ukraine when they have always done this in every single war of aggression they have launched anywhere on earth. In Iraq, the U.S. starved 500,000 children to death even before its invasion and occupation, which killed another 1 million Iraqi human beings, men, women, and children. Do you remember Secretary of State Madeleine Albright saying it was worth it?
Meanwhile, it's no secret that the sanctions are causing hardships. It's not the leaders who are suffering, it's the people, and especially the children. This is a ward in a pediatric hospital in Baghdad for severely malnourished children. And everywhere we went, we saw children like these, malnourished, some close to starvation. We saw children who needed medicine they couldn't get. And this little boy died of pneumonia an hour after we took these pictures because there were no antibiotics.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it. It is a moral question, but the moral question is even a larger one. Don't we owe to the American people and to the American military and to the other countries in the region that this man not be a threat?
It was worth it to starve to death 500,000 children to prevent Iraq from obtaining weapons of mass destruction the U.S. knew they didn't have and weren't pursuing. In Libya, vital infrastructure for agriculture was deliberately destroyed. The great man-made river. They struck infrastructure that supported its operations specifically to shut it down. In Syria, the U.S. seized and denied grain to deliberately starve the Syrian civilian population. We have U.S. officials at these think tank events bragging about how they have the grain, they have the oil, they're going to freeze and starve the Syrian population into submission. And then they did.
Still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime. This is, in our assessment, one of Russia's goals in the Middle East is the propaganda win for Russia of rehabilitating Assad on the international stage, of basically forcing the international community to normalize him and welcome him back in without any behavioral changes. So holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. and 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argue that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
And now the US seeks to do all of these things to Iran, and it is doing all of these things to Iran. As the US continues destroying Iran and more egregious crimes against humanity required to do so, it will depend on its Israeli proxies to carry them out, or at least claim to carry them out. Attacks that will cause immense human death and the destruction of vital infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. Also, the US can claim plausible deniability for itself. Again, the whole purpose of having proxies is to absorb all of the pain and costs and to take all of the blame for anything that goes wrong. However, and keep this in mind, every single bomb, every single missile, every warplane, and every drop of fuel Israel uses was given to it by the United States. Every target is fixed by US intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and each sortie made possible by US capabilities Israel does not have, including extensive aerial refueling capabilities, suppression of air defenses, region-wide radar enabling situational awareness, and even combat search and rescue operations. All of that, these are all capabilities the US has region-wide that Israel does not have and could not carry out any of these attacks without. Every Israeli action is an American action, and I'm going to make this point later on in this post, but I'm going to make it again right now. Just because the US is using Israel to do all of this does not mean that Israelis involved in doing this are somehow absolved of responsibility. They are as guilty as the Americans using them. Thus, every protest by the US is an act of theater, primarily because if the US doesn't want these targets hit, it will simply deny Israel the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and coordinated operational capabilities, again, aerial refueling, suppression of air defenses, etc., required to hit them. If they don't want a fuel depot hit, they just won't give Israel the intelligence required. They will not refuel their planes as they go there and come back. The US knows everything that's going on in the entire region. This is a joint military operation. There is a single command center that the US is running, just like in Germany, overseeing the war in Ukraine. They're running everything from top to bottom. There's no way Israel's carrying out rogue operations on its own without the US's knowing it and approving of it and having proposed it in the first place. Again, look at America's track record. Why would this be the first war that the US wants to do right, and it's just evil Israel undermining them at every turn? People have to wake up. The US knows, however, no one knows or even cares about these material realities and will instead allow their myopic obsessions and emotions to convince themselves somehow the Israelis, not the Americans, are in the driver's seat, and these actions were Israeli, not American, despite the fact Israel wouldn't even exist in the first place, just like Ukraine, by the way, without full and constant US support. Again, this does not absolve Israel for its war crimes carried out amid this war of aggression. They're accomplices. They are equally guilty in this. Like America's proxies in Ukraine, all involved in atrocities must be fought against and held accountable. All involved. However, if you want the war to end and the danger eliminated, identify the root of the danger, not just obsess over the tips of the branches or their falling leaves, which is what Israel is, whether you want to admit it or not, whether you want to see the truth through your hatred or not. This is the US using yet another proxy in yet another region of the planet that it is destroying specifically to encircle and contain China, which is the ultimate goal. Now, I did do another post here on Telegram about the US bringing in an additional carrier, additional warplanes, and implying that this is going to last for at least another month with the long desire.
Okay, so we'll end that there. Okay, so that was interesting. It's such a heated topic right now. I don't really know what to think, but I don't mean I don't know what to think. I just want to think about a lot of things, I guess. Okay, let me go to my war Telegram channels. Okay, so today's March 10th. So Iranian missiles are still getting off the ground 12 days into this war. Launches detected towards Israel. The U.S. has moved Patriot and THAAD air defense systems from South Korea to the Middle East. Yonhap reports South Korea's president was reportedly upset over the decision and has voiced his opposition to the U.S. withdrawal of some air defense weapons, but we, South Korea, cannot fully enforce our opinion. Earlier today, 4 Iranian missile drones impacted Western Ruwais refinery in the UAE, resulting in massive fire breaking out, shrouding the city in smoke. The impact was in the western part of the refinery, as indicated on the map. UAE censorship has banned all media outlets from reporting this. Not a single other outlet has reported this. And so it's got the image of the smoke rising, and then it's got a map of showing a satellite showing where it was hit in this industrial complex, it looks like. The British airline British Airways is canceling all flights to and from Abu Dhabi until the end of this year, as well as flights to from Amman, Bahrain, Doha, Dubai, and Tel Aviv until the end of March. An Iranian ballistic impact in Beshemash. I'm terrible with names of things. Betshemsh. I believe that's in Israel. And it shows the bomb hitting and smoke. Iranian missile ballistic impacted. Okay, so this is just another angle of that. A Hezbollah missile hit the settlement of Krayot, Krayot, and it shows that. And it's in a residential area. It looks like apartment buildings, like high-rise apartment buildings, and then little cottage houses. The U.S. THAAD systems that were located in South Korea are being transferred to the Middle East after the loss of 2 ANTYP-2 radars. So I actually reported that. I don't know. I reported it on my X. I don't know if I talked about it on here. I think I did. Those are the radar that is attached to the THAAD systems or works with them somehow, that intercepts the missiles. They are extremely rare and extremely expensive to produce. Okay, so I switched to another channel. March 10th. Tehran is ready for de-escalation in the Middle East if neighboring countries stop using it to attack Iran, the country's president said. Iran's plans to charge a security fee from ships in the Persian Gulf, according to CNN. Advisors to U.S. President Donald Trump are urging him to formulate a plan for the U.S. withdrawal from the war in Iran, with Iran, announced to the public that the military has largely achieved its goals, reports the Wall Street Journal. Don't know if that's true. Against the backdrop of Trump's statements about the imminent end of the war and possible easing of sanctions against Russian oil, the price of oil has gone down to 89, it looks like, a barrel. 89. Trump confirmed that he will lift sanctions on the oil industry of other countries to stabilize the oil market. As already mentioned, other countries refers to Russia. After the conversation with Putin, this is a fairly predictable development of events. So Donald Trump had a phone conversation with Putin yesterday, and there was like a whole list of stuff put out about what they talked about, but I'd have to like scroll way too far to find it. Look, I'm gonna be real honest with you guys. If I can't get people to subscribe or like, YouTube will literally send aliens to my house. Do you want me to be probed? I need you to like and to subscribe. Thank you. Trump confirmed that he will send military ships to the Strait of Hormuz to control it. It hit a multi-story building again, but this time Bahrain. It is reported that one person was killed and several others injured in the attack. It shows a either missile or drone attack on buildings. This looks like a residential area too. Iran launched a missile strike on the American airbase Aisha in Bahrain. On the morning of March 10th, Iran carried out a combined missile and drone attack on the UAE, according to the Emirates Ministry of Defense. Natural gas prices in the European Union have risen by almost 90% due to the conflict with Ukraine, and the cost of oil has increased by about 40% from the European Commission. Our hands are free to expand the war. Security will be for everyone or for no one. It's us who will decide when the war will end, from the IRGC. The U.S. president threatened to strike Iran 20 times harder if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked. Earlier, Trump said that he has a plan to combat the oil price. The fragments of the missile that hit the girls' school in Manab bear the markings of U.S. munitions, according to the New York Times. Apparently, these fragments are of an American-made Tomahawk missile, the publication specified. Azerbaijan has sent humanitarian aid to Iran. It specified the cargo was sent at Elev's instruction. It includes about 30 tons of food and nearly 2 tons of medicine and medical supplies. So, and then this shows strikes on U.S. bases in UAE and Iraq. It shows satellite images. The Deputy Prime Minister of Spain criticized German Chancellor Merz for remaining silent when Trump attacked Spain in the White House, accusing him of behaving like a vassal of Trump and not defending his EU partner. North Korea will increase combat readiness of its armed forces in response to the military maneuvers of the U.S. and South Korea. Iran launched a missile strike on the U.S. military base Harhir in Iraqi Kurdistan, according to the IRGC. Judging by the information coming to me from the front, a spring offensive by Russian force. Okay, that's about the Russian war. A U.S. strike on an Iranian ship in the Persian Gulf. And so it shows people are driving on a street, and then you see the sea in front with a giant ship with smoke coming off. The IRG states that they have carried out strikes on oil and gas processing plants in Haifa, Israel, as well as on fuel tanks. Morning attack on the IRGC intelligence headquarters in Qom. It shows the attack. Another ship was attacked 36 nautical miles north of Abu Dhabi in AUE. No details have been provided yet. 4 countries in the Middle East region, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, have reduced their combined oil production by 6.7 barrels per day amid the crisis, reported Bloomberg. The IRGC and the Iranian leaders declare that they do not intend to stop the hostilities and conclude peace agreements. The aggressor must be punished to the fullest extent. The U.S. has relocated its Patriot and THAAD air defense systems from South Korea to the Middle East. Okay, we saw that on the other channel. Hezbollah reported it hit 3 more Merkava tanks with anti-tank missiles during the fighting. The battles in southern Lebanon continue, with the IDF trying to advance toward the Leti River. Meanwhile, Israel declares that it will continue the war against Hezbollah even if the war with Iran ends. This is another reason for Iran to stop the war and to not stop the war and to keep attacking Israel. So that's the other thing. Israel has moved into southern Lebanon and is also bombing them with missiles and drone strikes, and they've moved in on foot into southern Lebanon. So there's like a whole front there that people are paying attention to. Iran attacks Doha. Explosions are heard in the capital of Qatar. Iranian missile attack on the AUE is underway. The Iranian air defense system shot down another Iranian reconnaissance and strike drone, the Hermes, in the province of Liristan. High-quality satellite images show the destruction at an Iranian solid fuel missile production plant in Sharud. According to reports, almost all buildings in the solid fuel engine production lines were damaged or destroyed. In addition, several mixing and pouring workshops were affected as well, possibly non-destructive testing and preliminary mixing workshops. As expected, Shia formations in Iraq have restored to widespread use of not only drones and cruise missiles, but also conventional rocket launchers against U.S. bases and their allies. The latter are used for harassing local bombardment of relevant targets. In previous years, Iran ensured the filling of their is that there are actually Shia Muslim groups in all these countries, and some of them are parts of militias and stuff. And so they've begun attacking from inside the regional other countries in the Gulf. Okay, I found this, what Trump said about the Tomahawk missile. Trump stated that the Tomahawk is a very common missile which is sold to various countries and is available to Iran, so someone else could have launched an attack with them on the school in Minbay. So, like, that is just a crazy thing to say. I'm sorry, but that's just nuts. The Lockheed Martin company has been awarded a contract worth $700 million by the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon, to supply spare parts for F-35 aircraft, including to Denmark. Real estate prices in Dubai have fallen by 20% over the last month. Here they're pulling out a toddler from the rubble inside Tehran. Always got to be careful with those kind of stuff because you never know like exactly what war they're from. But this site's pretty good at not posting things that aren't true or from like other time periods and stuff like that. But it was the rubble of a building. The Israeli military discovered and destroyed a Hezbollah launcher in southern Lebanon. 4 Iranian diplomats were killed in an Israeli attack on Beirut on March 8th. the country's UN representative said. 6 civilians were killed and 37 injured in a missile strike on Barents, Governor Bogamaz reported. Okay, so I think that's Russia. That's Russia too. Okay, so that's some war update channels. Okay, so let's go watch another analyst that I follow, you know, not from America. So he, we're looking at all sources here. I showed you guys that one lady. Most geopolitical analysts are not going to be just telling you that this is all great and roses and stuff like that, because that would be being not a great analyst. Okay, so the one lady's super positive, and there's other people that report on her channel, and it's a super interesting perspective. And so I will, leave that down below. It's not just her. There's several other people in that outfit that say interesting things. Okay, so this is Alexander Mercurius. He's an analyst that I listen to often. He has jerky movements because he has like an illness, and I also have him sped up to 150, but he moves oddly. That's just natural. Like, that's just what he does.
Today is Tuesday, 10th March 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if, once you've watched or listened to this program, or whichever part of this program you want to watch or listen to, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Well, over the last 24 hours, we have seen a whole spate of contradictory messages and signals coming from the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and perhaps from members of his administration, which cumulatively do seem to suggest growing doubts about the progress of the military operation against Iran, and perhaps the first steps towards seeking some kind of off-ramp. One needs to be extremely careful what one says about all of this, however, because one also gets messages which still seem to imply a decision to seek further escalation. Of course, the two are not necessarily in contradiction. It might be the case that the president and his officials have begun to understand that the situation is not going according to plan at all, that they are looking for an off-ramp. They may sense the political and economic damage that the war is causing, but as many people who find themselves in that kind of situation often do, they respond at the same time by escalating, by attempting to change the situation to their advantage, even as they try to look for a way out. Now, we had a whole cascade of comments and statements yesterday, many of them from the president himself. And of course, the background to these comments was the surge in oil prices that I discussed yesterday. And well, there was that report, which I also discussed yesterday in the Financial Times, about the G7 states releasing oil from their strategic reserves. President Macron of France then subsequently came out with a statement saying that no decision to do anything of that kind had in fact been made. But for several hours, there were lots of reports about releasing oil from the strategic reserves. I've seen two articles, one in Euro Intelligence and one in the Financial Times, which both suggested that releasing oil from the reserves might not actually have the long-term effect on pushing down oil prices that perhaps the president and his officials might hope, that the benefit of a release of oil from the reserves would be only short-term, that eventually the reserves would have to be built up again, which would mean taking oil from the market, not returning it to the market, which might in time actually put upward pressure on prices. The article in Euro Intelligence also made the point that when talking about the strategic reserves of the G7, there are differences between the various G7 states. In some cases, such as France, the entire strategic reserve is held nationally by the French government. In other countries, and Euro Intelligence didn't name them, but in other countries it is a mix, with some of the reserves held by the government, but other reserves held by industry and by private companies, and they might be less willing to release any part of their reserves. And anyway, the Euro Intelligence article made the further point that there are anyway legal limits to how much oil can be released from the strategic reserves. In all of the G7 countries, there is apparently a legal obligation to retain at least 90 days of oil, 90 days of usage of oil in the reserves to cover major emergencies such as a war, a natural disaster, things of that kind, and that the fact that the price of oil has reached a certain level is not in accordance with these laws, enough in itself or sufficient cause in itself to deplete these reserves beyond a certain level. I discussed this whole topic at length yesterday. I'm not going to repeat what I said. All I would say again is that if we do get into a crisis situation where there is going to be a major depletion of reserves, then inevitably countries are going to hold on to what reserves they have. There will be reluctance to share oil from the reserves, and that might create a whole further set of problems. So tapping the reserves is not a long-term solution to the crisis. And in fact, it became increasingly clear yesterday that faced by what looked like an inexorably rising oil price, much of the president's response was in effect declaratory, saying again that the conflict with Iran, which has already continued for around 10 days, that is going to be a short one. He spoke about how the United States is ahead of its timetable in the war. But then, of course, as he's never released the timetable, we've no way of confirming that. And for the record, I don't believe him when he says this. He also said that the war itself was like a little excursion. Again, trying to play down its scale, despite the fact that apparently half the available US Air Force and a third of the US Navy has been committed to the war.
Okay, so what he's saying there is that people, like, especially with markets, like people in the markets and stuff, they watch everything presidents say, leaders of countries say. So when the rhetoric started coming out that this is going to be like, when CENTCOM's like, oh, we're going to be preparing for 100 days. And then Trump's like, we could go on forever. And then Iran is saying, we could go on for 10 years and stuff. Well, that starts affecting the market. So now they're changing the rhetoric, right? To making it sound much shorter, much less complicated, much less scary for the markets. Do you see what I mean?
Commitment which may increase once the third carrier, the George H.W. Bush, arrives on the scene. But anyway, he said it was all a little excursion. He also said that 90% or something like that of the objectives had already been achieved. The Iranian Navy, which of course was never a major part of Iran's military. Anyway, that the Iranian military has now been sunk, mostly. About that, by the way, he is mostly telling the truth. That the rest of the Iranian military has been badly defeated, and that Iran's political system, its political leadership, has been destroyed. Although self-evidently it has not been destroyed, Iran has a new supreme leader, Khamenei II. Pezeshkian, the president, is still alive, and all of the military leaders who were killed together with the previous supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, appear to have been replaced. So anyway, the president said all of those things. And it's clear that the reports about release of oil from the strategic reserves and all of these reassurances from the president that the war would end soon, that all of these things did have some reassurance effect on global energy markets. The price of oil yesterday slipped below $100 a barrel, and I believe it is currently trading closer to $90 a barrel, still significantly above where it was before the start of the war, but perhaps not quite at the catastrophic levels that we saw briefly yesterday. Having said that, declarations that the war will be short, talk about releasing oil from the reserves, all of those things can only have an effect for a short time. Somehow or other, in some way or other, something more decisive needs to happen in order to turn the situation around. And the president again had more to say about this. He was complaining about the fact that the crews of the tankers in the Persian Gulf seemed to lack courage and seemed unwilling to brave the Straits of Hormuz. I understand, by the way, that one tanker did attempt to do that this morning, but was attacked by drones of the IRGC and has apparently suffered significant damage.
Okay, so like I was explaining earlier, the Navy doesn't really guard that Strait of Hormuz all that much, like the IRGC, the Iranian regime's Navy. It's these little tiny ships that are super fast and they can shoot off a missile and then they can shoot away. And so the ships are still in danger.
The reports for the moment are unclear, and I'm not exactly sure what happened. The administration has apparently cobbled together a plan to cover the insurance costs of tankers in the Persian Gulf that want to risk the Straits of Hormuz. The total amount in this insurance fund, which as far as I'm aware has up to now had no takers, is $20 billion or so, I believe. I don't think that is anywhere near enough for the
I had no idea that that had no takers. Like, that's crazy news. Wow.
kind of risks that these tankers would face. And anyway, there are still lots of uncertainties about this scheme, which to my knowledge has not yet received congressional approval and may never will, though I presume that under US law it would need to. Anyway, I don't think this amount of $20 billion in this fund is anywhere near close to being big enough to give assurance to ship owners, even if the crews themselves were prepared to risk their lives by trying to pass through the Straits of Hormuz. In any event, the Straits of Hormuz, as of the time of making this program, continue to remain closed. The IRGC continues to play cat and mouse over this issue. They sometimes talk about granting licenses to tankers to pass through, but the way in which these licenses would be granted remains extraordinarily vague. And, well, the IRGC yesterday apparently floated an offer that tankers of countries which ended diplomatic relations with Israel and the United States would be able to pass the Straits of Hormuz. Another astonishing declaratory statement, which obviously has no meaning, because I cannot imagine that any countries that have diplomatic relations with those two countries, Israel and the United States, would be prepared to take that step, even in order to get the Straits of Hormuz unblocked. And, well, there continues to be a lot of chatter in the media and from some Western officials about some kind of operation, military operation, to open the Straits of Hormuz. President Macron of France, who never balks at the opportunity to put French military personnel in danger, was talking about this extensively. He talked about some kind of operation by France and other countries, a defensive operation, as he called it, to secure freedom of navigation in the Eastern Mediterranean, in all sorts of places. But he threw in the Gulf of Hormuz for good measure, and he is indeed busy deploying the French fleet, such as it is, in ways that might imply that it too will be part of this operation. The British government, with a fleet in considerably worse shape than the French.
I wonder if there is like another option. Yes, there are alternative logistical routes for exporting oil from the Persian Gulf states that bypass the Strait of Hormuz, although they are limited in capacity and primarily available to only a few countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran. These alternatives mainly involve overland pipelines that redirect crude oil to ports outside the strait, such as the Red Sea or the Gulf of Oman. Okay, so this is the Red Sea and this is the Gulf of Oman right here. But why can't they go this way? However, countries like Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar and Bahrain have little to no such infrastructure and remain heavily dependent on the strait. Oman's exports partially bypass it naturally due to its geography. Given recent conflicts leading to disruptions or blockade near the Strait of Hormuz, these alternatives have come under increased scrutiny with limited spare capacity and logistical challenges exposed. For context, global exports through the strait averaged around 20 million barrels per day in 2025, so these bypass options can only handle a fraction of that volume. Okay, so here's a pipeline that goes to a port in the Red Sea, and it does 5 to 7 million barrels a day. Here in the United Arab Emirates has a pipeline that goes to the Gulf of Oman, 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels a day. And then that one doesn't really matter. These pipelines represent the primary viable options, blah, blah, blah. Other potential ideas like new pipelines or overland routes to the Mediterranean via Iraq to Turkey exist but are not operational at scale for Gulf exports and face their own geopolitical hurdles. Okay, so what hurdles? The main hurdles to getting oil out of the Gulf states primarily Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, without relying on the Strait of Hormuz, bore down to several limitations existing infrastructure, especially amid the global conflict where tanker traffic through the strait. These alternatives are not scalable to replace 20 million barrels a day. Limited pipeline capacity. Not all Gulf states have access. Only Saudi Arabia and the EU have viable bypass pipelines. Countries like Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar and Bahrain have no meaningful alternatives. Logistical and operation challenges. Routing requirements. Shifting tankers to the Red Sea or Gulf. But why can't we go to the Mediterranean? Okay, so Mediterranean hurdles are intergovernmental disputes in Iraq, ongoing revenue sharing conflicts between Iraq's federal government and Baghdad and his semi-autonomous Kurdistan regional government have repeatedly shut down the pipeline. For instance, in 2023, arbitration ruling required Turkey to pay Iraq 1.5 billion. Okay, well, that's not good. Turkey terminated the 1973 pipeline agreement effective July 26, forcing renegotiations. Cross-border agreements, attacks and sabotage. The pipeline has been targeted by drone strikes, ISIS remnants, and militias. Well, that's not good. Regional war spillover. I don't why does it have to go through Turkey and Iraq? Why can't it go through Jordan and Israel? Why can't it go this way? Okay, I don't know.
French, by the way, appears to be reconsidering the idea of deploying one of its carriers to this operation. But anyway, let's not waste time with what the French and the British might do. The only country that has the means to deploy forces to the Straits of Hormuz, which might conceivably be able to break the Iranian blockade, is the United States. And, well, it seems to me that this is a very problematic military operation, even for the United States itself. Simplicius the Thinker has written a fine article on his Substack site discussing why it is actually exceptionally difficult for Iran to sink US Navy carriers. He makes in this article, but in much more detail, some of the points I have seen, and indeed made myself, about how carriers are constantly moving maneuverable targets, how ballistic missiles, or indeed ship cruise missiles launched at these targets would find them difficult to attack, because in the case of ballistic missiles do not generally strike targets. They do not have radar homing. They do not carry radar homing to attack moving targets. The only country that is known to have that capability at the moment, that has anti-ship ballistic missiles on land with radar homing, is China. Iran does not have that capability at the moment. So a missile...
Okay, so that's really interesting. So the ships, US big ships, they're constantly moving, and they have maneuvering capabilities to counter this type of thing. And Iran does not have the actual radar on the ballistics, which is really interesting. And it's also interesting that China's the only country that has that. That's really, really interesting.
Launched from Iran towards where Iran believes the carrier to be, might quite easily, in fact would most likely find that the expensive missile might miss the carrier. And Simplicius the Thinker also discusses how cruise missiles, even very, very fast cruise missiles launched against carriers, would also be unlikely to find the carriers, because they will have moved before the cruise missiles arrive, and the cruise missiles anyway would probably be vulnerable to shooting down by the anti-aircraft and missiles of the carriers escorting destroyers. It was a very interesting article, one which actually bears reading, and which I think might allay many of the questions and doubts that many people have about this question. I think I can summarize it by saying that a successful attack on a carrier by Iran at the present time would be basically a lucky hit, a very unlikely lucky hit. And this is in part because anyway, the United States Navy is careful to deploy its carriers and its other warships in open seas, a significant distance from Iran itself, that obviously limits the capabilities of the carriers to conduct airstrikes against Iran because of the distance the aircraft would have to cover. But at the same time, it does make it very, very difficult, all but impossible, in fact, for Iran to attack those carriers. But if there is an operation to open the Straits of Hormuz, the US warships would have to position themselves very much closer to the Iranian coastline. In fact, if we're talking about the Straits of Hormuz, within visual distance in some cases of the Iranian coastline, they would have far less maneuver space. They would become easy targets, or much easier targets, for Iranian drone and missile strikes. Damage would be done. Air defense systems would be rapidly depleted. There will be significant vulnerability to sea mines, which the Iranians used in the 1980s, and that capability and skill they undoubtedly still have. And well, this would be a massively problematic operation, and one which I get the sense the US Navy is not keen to embark upon at all. For the record.
Okay, so I have something interesting to read. This is from one of the war channels that I follow, but this person's more of an analyst. I think cheerleaders on both sides are being too flippant. Iran is suffering severe attrition to its conventional military forces. Its conventional navy has been wiped out, though it wouldn't have made a difference either way. Its air force is grounded or destroyed, and its air defense is being degraded. There's a good chance the US and Israel could achieve air supremacy in the coming weeks. Hey guys, so it's that time where I need to ask you to subscribe to the channel, and if you're already subscribed, just hit the like, please. If you don't do this, I will be abducted by aliens. Thanks. There is a good chance the US and Israel could achieve air supremacy in the coming weeks, which would make shortages in standoff munitions meaningless, as the US could instead dip into its immense stockpiles, cheap-ish gravity bombs and such, and bomb most of Iran at will in free hunting mode. The US-Israel coalition could ramp up attacks against Iranian energy and water infrastructure, potentially leading to large-scale humanitarian catastrophe. Iran is facing a long-term austere war economy situation, and it's hard to tell how long it could be able to weather that. However, the Iranians have succeeded in severely degrading U.S. radar installations and missile defense in the region, and interceptor stockpiles are running low. They still have deep stockpiles of missiles and drones and are keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed, sending shockwaves through the entire global economy. The U.S. vassal states in the Gulf are suffering and may fall into a death spiral soon-ish unless they push for de-escalation via distancing themselves from the U.S. U.S. military bases in the area have been devastated. Air supremacy over the entire country has not yet been established. Localized air superiority, sure, but a majority of strikes are still standoff munitions, and the eastern half of Iran remains entirely untouched so far. The Iranians can respond to escalation by targeting infrastructure in Israel and the Gulf states, and have the capability to also cause widespread humanitarian catastrophe. Desalination plants, electricity generation, and a lot of juicy targets that remain untouched so far. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Trump has claimed the U.S. Navy would reopen it, but the IRGC speedboat fleet is mostly untouched so far. The actual Iranian Navy you'd expect to play a role in the war. The Iranians can potentially strike U.S. ships going through the strait with a variety of weapons. According to some napkin math, even if Iran's conventional forces are truly defeated from the air, decentralized IRGC forces with localized drone stockpiles and production will retain the ability to lob several shaheeds a day at the Strait of Hormuz pretty much indefinitely. It's a race against time on both sides, with many levels of escalation still open. Interesting.
I think that any operation to unblock the Straits of Hormuz whilst the war is ongoing is so dangerous, so high risk, that I don't personally think that the United States is going to attempt it at all. I've seen all sorts of reports and claims about this, but frankly, I don't think it's going to happen. Just saying. So, for the moment, the Straits of Hormuz remain closed. Shipping from the Persian Gulf remains impossible. And, well, adding to the president's problems, adding to the problems that the global economy is facing, is the fact that Persian Gulf producers, the Gulf states, are increasingly under increasing pressure. Their storage tanks are becoming filled. Their ability to export oil is reducing. Bahrain yesterday followed Qatar by declaring force majeure. Sooner or later, the other Gulf states are bound to do the same. And today, Saudi Aramco, the oil company, the state oil company of Saudi Arabia, responsible for Saudi Arabia's oil exports, talked about a catastrophic situation in global energy markets if the war continued for much longer and if the Straits of Hormuz remained closed. Now, Aramco did also say that they are trying to divert more of Saudi Arabia's oil exports to the Red Sea ports. They believe that within a few days, they will be able to export 70% of Saudi Arabia's production through the Red Sea. Perhaps, I have no reason to doubt that they can do that. But again, a 30% reduction in Saudi export of oil, combined with a stop in exports by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE, remains a catastrophic decline in the amount of Persian Gulf oil that is reaching world energy markets. And Saudi Aramco were careful to say that. So, if the Straits of Hormuz cannot be forced open, if, as appears to be the case, the political situation in Iran remains stable, if more military pressure on Iran is not going to change that position anytime soon, what does the United States, what does the president do? He's, of course, floated the possibility in the past about an incursion by the Kurds in western Iran. Then he seemed to walk that back, and we've seen reports that the Kurds themselves are very, very skeptical and doubtful of an operation of that kind. We've had reports that the 82nd Airborne Division is going to be transferred to the Middle East, and we've seen suggestions about some kind of military operation to seize Harg Island, Iran's major oil terminal. Well, that would be a very, very complex operation in itself, one carrying its own set of risks. I'm not sure anyway how it solves the overall problem in terms of the Straits of Hormuz. And besides, an operation like that, not just seizing Harg Island, but consolidating control of it, securing control of it, might in itself take some time and might lead to further escalation and might start creating further concern and crisis in world energy markets. And beneath it all, behind it all, we have the continuous tension, the problems being created by the fact that all reports now speak of weapon stocks running low, precision-guided weapon stocks running low. There was a report yesterday that there are large numbers of flights of aircraft to Israel to replenish Israeli arsenals of weapons, which, by the way, also suggests that the drawdown of weapons in Israel has been very, very fast, so that Israel is having to turn, presumably, to the United States urgently for further supplies. Well, there's this concern, and for the moment at least, Iran continues to conduct its counterstrikes against Israel, against American bases across the Middle East, and across a range of targets using its drones and its ballistic missiles. The Iranians, incidentally, are saying that the effectiveness of their drone and missile strikes has been such that the United States has had to empty its bases of personnel, that it's had to pull its fleet 1,000 kilometers from the Iranian coast, and that it is having to redeploy many of the personnel, the US personnel who used to staff the US bases, to hotel buildings across the Gulf states, and that this is why Iran is currently attacking those hotel buildings. This is an Iranian claim. I don't know whether or not it is true. It may be true. It wouldn't surprise me if it is, but then this is a war. The parties to a war say many things. One can't be sure unless one knows whether what is said is true. What the Iranians are also saying is that no one should read anything into the fact that there has been a reduction in drone and missile strikes. Iran is able to continue to conduct drone strikes, and now, instead of using thousands of smaller missiles, as it did in the opening days of the war, because of the depletion of US and Israeli and Gulf Arab missile arsenals, and because of the mass destruction of American radar systems that took place in the first days of the war, Iran can be more selective in the targets that it strikes, and it doesn't have to worry about many of its missiles and drones being intercepted. And for that reason, it is now using bigger, more powerful ballistic missiles to attack targets, and it's shown pictures of it doing so.
Yeah, so I did see that. I did see that they were moving up to the larger, the heavier missile stuff, and they are still, their missiles are still being intercepted. It's not like nothing's not getting intercepted. But like, I follow the war channels all the time, and it will be like, what it is people in the area send things in. So they'll say, like, say if somebody's in Israel, for example, they will, just a person, they'll be like, sirens are going off, alerts are going off. So then on the war channels, it's like they get this sent to them, and then they're like, such and such missile incoming in whatever place wherever the person is. Then once the missile hits, the person sends the video of it, and then they're like, such and such missile hits such and such area, with like a picture. And so definitely they're not intercepting all of them. And then another thing that I noticed, I think it started yesterday or the day before, is that Iran is using cluster missile ammunitions now, or munitions. And I've seen several videos where missile is coming, and then it's going to get intercepted, and then it breaks apart into like 6 or 7 missiles, and so then the interceptor only gets like 1 or 2 of them. Look, I'm gonna be real honest with you guys. If I can't get people to subscribe or like, YouTube will literally send aliens to my house. Do you want me to be probed? I need you to like and to subscribe. Thank you.
It says that the more advanced hypersonic missiles are still being held
I didn't know
back
they had those.
and have not been used.
I didn't know they
At
had
least one of the
hypersonic.
films that I saw did appear to suggest that one of these bigger missiles was being launched, not from a mobile launcher, which the United States claims that it has destroyed in large numbers, that it has destroyed them in large numbers, but it seemed as if this missile had been launched from some kind of ground silo, basically a hole in the ground, the bunker.
I saw those.
There being presumably a bunker
Yeah, it's
beneath
just
the
like
hole,
a hole,
the
and
missiles
the missiles being
kept there
launched
and
out of
maybe
the hole.
launched through the silo. Again, I'm not going to discuss the technology of this, which is, again, not my thing. But maybe there are large numbers of Iranian missiles hidden away underground in this way. Maybe there are large numbers of silos that Iran has. Maybe, as the Iranians also say, most of the ground launchers that the Israelis and the Americans think that they've destroyed are decoys. I don't know, and have no information, no independent information about any of these things. But again, it remains the case that the Iranians are continuing to conduct strikes, and they do seem to be using more powerful missiles. And it does seem that the Americans and the Israelis have less ability to intercept them. And of course, if you believe Professor Postol, who, by the way, I mostly do, maybe they don't have that ability to intercept these missiles, these ballistic missiles at all. I noticed, by the way, that one prominent actor in this drama, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, seems to have practically disappeared from sight. He's saying very little, and I think over the last few days, nothing at all. He's leaving it to the president to say all that needs to be said, all that is being said. And maybe a possible reason why we are hearing so much less from Prime Minister Netanyahu is because he also understands that this operation is not going well, and that things are happening, such as the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, the crisis in the energy markets, the destruction of the American radar systems across the Middle East, the continued strikes on Israel and across the Middle East by Iran with its heavy missiles and its drones, which he did not anticipate and which perhaps he reassured the president would not happen. But then that brings us back to the president himself. He's told people yesterday that the war would be short, that it was a short excursion.
Okay, so there is stuff like that coming out of Israel in publication. So here's one. The war with Iran will last at least 2 more weeks, and it is unlikely to end with the overthrow of the I can never say this word, the regime. Reports the Israel publication Yanet, citing sources. The Ayatollah. Anyway, the publication notes that the euphoria that marked the beginning of the operation has been replaced by disappointment and pessimism, as the Iranian regime still seems stable. At the beginning of the war, one of its goals was considered to be the overthrow of the regime in Iran. Now, according to estimates, the regime remains stable, and the scenario of a possible uprising against the authorities or other options for regime change seems unlikely. According to its information, Netanyahu is already preparing the public opinion for the possibility that the war may not end with the fall of the Ayatollah regime. Only Trump will determine when the campaign will end, but according to Israel sources, it will not end in the next 2 weeks. The last word has not yet been said. Steve Witkoff was asked how, in his opinion, the war would end. I don't know, he said. In Israel, it is assumed that the only person will decide when the war will end, U.S. President Donald Trump. Therefore, Israel is striving to accelerate military operations as much as possible, the publication says. Okay, then Netanyahu came out and said, again to the Iranian people, and I'm telling you guys, this is not going to happen, and I'm not going to explain it all here why this is not going to happen, but this is not going to happen. So this is the Prime Minister of Israel to the Iranian people. Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu, in an address to the Iranian people, the Ayatollahs and their aides are fleeing, but these cowards have nowhere to hide. In the coming days, we will create conditions for you to take control of your own destiny. When the moment comes, and it is rapidly approaching, we will pass the torch to you. Be ready to seize the moment. But I guess we will see. I guess anything is possible in the world. Who knows?
That it would be over very soon, that most of the objectives had originally been achieved. Well, to me, and I think in the energy markets, it starts to look as if at least one part of the president's mind is starting to turn to the possibility of looking for an off-ramp, of trying to find some means to extricate himself and the United States from this war, which has gone terribly, horribly wrong. And, well, we've had reports from the Wall Street Journal that there are officials within the US administration who are now advising the president that this has gone as far as it can go and that the war needs to end. And interestingly, there have been identical reports in Israel itself that there are Israeli officials who are worrying about whether an open-ended war comes with disastrous consequences for the global economy, but also perhaps more pressingly for Donald Trump's political position in the United States. The calculation apparently being that Israel cannot afford the political implosion of a US president because he stood by and supported Israel. Just so. So we are starting to see signs that perhaps the president and at least some of his officials, even whilst they continue to talk about continuing the war, might be looking for some sort of off-ramp. And yesterday, the single most important thing that points in that direction duly took place. The president of the United States, Donald Trump, picked up the phone and telephoned Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Yep. Now, the Russians, as is their way, have now published a very detailed briefing about this conversation, and it has been provided by Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. And I'm going to read it in full, and I'm going to make a few comments about it. This is what Ushakov said yesterday at 2022, 30 hours Moscow time. This evening, notice it happened in the evening, this evening, a conversation took place between the presidents of Russia and the United States. Donald Trump telephoned Vladimir Putin to discuss a number of highly important issues related to the current international situation. So the Russians are saying clearly, without any ambiguity, without any doubt, that it was Trump who called Putin. It was Trump who initiated the call, and called Putin. I've discussed in many programs how, in a readout of telephone conversations between governments, when a government confirms that it was the other side that sought the call, what the government that publishes the fact is telling us is that the government that initiated the call came begging. And that clearly is what happened in this call between Trump and Putin. Trump called Putin because he wants Putin's help. And then Ushakov continues, naturally, particular attention was given to the situation surrounding the conflict with Iran, as well as the ongoing trilateral negotiations on the Ukrainian settlement involving representatives of the United States. Note the order. First Iran, then Ukraine. For the first time since Putin and Trump have been speaking to each other, Ukraine is not the topic highest on the agenda. This time, the topic highest on the agenda is Iran. By the way, on that point, Zelensky himself is extremely unhappy about this. He said yesterday that there'd been an agreement between the Americans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians that today there should be more talks, a continuation of the trilateral talks, that they were supposed to happen in Istanbul. Remember, Zelensky has been very hostile to the talks up to now. He's always resisted holding the talks. He didn't want these talks to happen at all. Back in the autumn of 2025, in November 2025, he said that the bilateral negotiations between Russia and Ukraine were completely called off. Now, however, he is complaining that the Americans and the Russians postponed the talks in Istanbul that were supposed to take place today. So he's not happy. Previously, he wasn't happy that the talks were happening. Now he's not happy because the talks are being postponed. The reason he is not happy is because he senses that the Americans are losing interest in Ukraine, that they're not supplying Ukraine with the weapons that Ukraine needs and wants, and because, as we will see, the Russians are now starting to gain leverage over the Americans because the Americans have got themselves into a mess over Iran. Anyway, going back to Ushakov, it is Iran that was the main topic of discussion in the call between Trump and Putin yesterday. And then Ushakov goes on to say this. I would note at the outset that the conversation was businesslike, frank, and constructive, as is typically the case in dialogue between the Russian and American leaders. Businesslike, frank. Now, no words here about the conversation between being sincere, which is, or warm, both adjectives to discuss conversations between Putin and Trump, which Ushakov has used in the past. Instead, we have businesslike and frank. And as I and several others, notably Larry Johnson, have pointed out, the word frank can often be taken to mean, in Russian readouts and descriptions of these kind of conversations, that the conversation was contentious, perhaps even heated at times. Well, I would say that in relation to this particular conversation, referring to the meeting as frank and businesslike rather does suggest that. It suggests that this was a contentious call altogether. There were clearly disagreements and pushback and perhaps argument. It's not inconceivable that the conversation was at times heated. It is interesting that Ushakov now says that this is becoming typical of the conversations between Trump and Putin, which suggests that the bromance that was characteristic of their earlier calls and of the Alaska meeting has now completely gone away, just saying. But Ushakov does nonetheless tell us that the meeting was constructive. And then he reminds us of something else. They, Putin and Trump, had not spoken by telephone for quite some time. Their previous conversation took place at the end of December 2025. I have been making
Okay, so the last phone call they had in December 29th was because of that hit on his residence, one of his residences that the CIA carried out with Ukraine in attempt to kill him. And he hasn't talked to President Trump since, because he called President Trump and was basically like, did you try to kill me?
that point in many programs. In fact, there has been no conversations between Putin and Trump since that telephone call on the 29th of December 2025. Or to be more precise, two conversations that took place on the 29th of December 2025. And as we know, what happened between those two conversations that took place on the 29th of December 2025 was that Ukraine carried out a drone attack on Novgorod region in Russia, as the Russians say, and as I have no doubt took place on Putin's Valdai residence. The Russians have not wanted to talk to Trump, or at least have made no effort to talk to Trump since that meeting, since that conversation, when the Russians clearly feel an attempt was made to attack the building where the Americans and the Ukrainians probably thought Putin was located, almost certainly in the case of the Ukrainians, with the intention of killing him. So Ushakov is again careful to remind us of this. He is reminding us of not just of the fact that the call took place a while ago, but he's also implicitly reminding us of what took place during that call and by implication again, of the reasons why, following those events on the 29th of December of 2025, the Russian and American presidents have not spoken to each other up to now since. And then Ushakov tells us something else. Today's call, incidentally, lasted about an hour. A long call, in general, I mean, if leaders speak to each other for an hour by phone, then that is usually a long call, but not in the case of the interactions between Putin and Trump. By their standards, this was a relatively short call. A short call, that Ushakov says, was frank, constructive, and businesslike. A rather contentious call, a call over which there was clearly disagreement. But anyway, he then tells us this. The US president noted that, as previously agreed, such contacts should take place on a regular basis, and both leaders confirmed that they are ready for this. In other words, Trump complains to Putin that Putin, up to now, ever since December, has not been willing to speak to him. That's my interpretation of these words. But isn't it the obvious one? And Trump says, please, when I call you, please speak to me from now on. We do need to remain in touch. And Putin says, okay, we should. Anyway, Ben Ushakov says this. The president of Russia set out a number of considerations aimed at achieving a prompt political and diplomatic settlement of the Iranian conflict, including in light of the contacts he has recently held with leaders of the Gulf states, with President of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, and with the leaders of several other countries. So, Putin is telling Trump this war is a terrible mistake. We know that Putin thinks this because he's referred to it as an act of aggression against Iran. The Russians have issued public statements condemning this attack, saying that it's appalling that it took place in the midst of negotiations. Putin messaged Pezeshkian saying that the killing of Khamenei was an appalling, immoral, illegal, and cynical act. So there is no doubt what Putin thinks about this war. There is no doubt that the Russians have taken Iran's side in this war. The Russian ambassador to Britain said so quite explicitly. He said that Russia is not neutral in this conflict. It is on Iran's side. And of course, we've seen many reports, which I believe to be true, and which, in fact, I'm certain are true, based on information I have received, that the Russians have been providing intelligence to Iran. So Putin will have told Trump all of these things, that Russia supports Iran, that it is on Iran's side, that the attack on Iran was totally unjustified.
The thing is, though, that that's not unusual. The United States provides intelligence to Ukraine on Russia, and that's why the Ukraine is able to strike certain places inside of Russia, like the interior of Russia, with the help of our intelligence. So that's not something like incredibly unusual.
It was aggression, but Putin will also have told Trump something else. I am in touch with the Iranians. I am in touch with the Arab Gulf states. I am in a position to mediate between you and them, and I have ideas about how this conflict can be ended if you are looking for an off-ramp. And unlike you, I can talk to the Iranians about them, and I can talk to the Gulf states, and if it is indeed an off-ramp that you are seeking, I might be able to provide it. And going back to Ushakov's briefing, we see that Ushakov said that Putin set out a number of considerations aimed at achieving a prompt political and diplomatic settlement of the Iranian conflict. Notice that the briefing speaks of considerations rather than proposals. That, of course, is exactly what a mediator is supposed to do. Mediators are not supposed to be in the business of setting up proposals, just saying. But anyway, when Putin talks about considerations, it is probably proposals that he actually means. And then we go on to read, for his part, the US president shared his assessment of developments in the context of the ongoing US-Israeli operation. In other words, Trump provided Putin with some kind of military update. And then Ushakov says, I would note that a very substantive and, I believe, exchange of views took place on this matter. So no agreements were reached, no commonality of positions was reached. When we hear about an exchange of views, again, that suggests that the discussion was contentious, but the Russians still think it was useful, probably because they were able to explain their opposition to this whole conflict to Trump and put him in no possible doubt about that, but perhaps because they also signaled to Trump that, as I said, if he was looking for an off-ramp, the Russians might indeed be in a position to provide it. And then we have the afterthought. President Trump once again expressed interest in bringing the conflict in Ukraine to an end as soon as possible by achieving a ceasefire that would open the way to a long-term settlement. So Trump is again talking about a ceasefire, which of course the Russians have rejected. Notice that the briefing does not say that Putin agreed with this. On the contrary, what Putin is reported to have said in response was that on our side, a positive assessment was given of the mediation efforts undertaken by Trump's team and by him personally. An assessment, however, was also provided of the current situation along the line of contact, where Russian forces are advancing successfully. As was noted, this is a factor that should compel the Kiev regime.
Okay, so this is something that the Trump administration is constantly doing that doesn't make any sense to me. You do not have to have a ceasefire in place to start the negotiation process. In fact, many times in history, negotiations start without a ceasefire intact. It was the same thing in Vietnam. Negotiations went on for months and months and months, and there was no ceasefire. But the problem is like we don't have very good diplomats in America anymore. It's sort of a lost art because we've been such a powerhouse that we don't really have to have super like awesome diplomatic skills, right? We could just bomb anyone into existence or out of existence. We can kidnap leaders, whatever. So we don't need diplomatic skills. Well, we really do. We should be using them more. But Putin is an amazing diplomat and statesman, so he's always working out all kinds of things. And so he keeps like getting confused and trying to tell the United States that there doesn't need to be a ceasefire to start having serious negotiations start. But the United States is just constantly like, we need a ceasefire. But that's not logistically smart. They have spent all this time, all these years to get to where they are now, and they have huge momentum. And if they agreed to a ceasefire, they would lose all that work that they did to get to this point, to have this momentum. Plus, then there's certain times of the year that things can't go on because of the rainy season, so things calm down. So they have certain things that they have to achieve and do. And especially the spot that they're in right now, they have worked really hard to get to this place where they're having really good momentum. If they stop that because of a ceasefire, then that gives Ukraine the time to rearm, regroup, move out their troops, blah blah blah, and then then Russia loses that momentum. So they do not want to agree to a ceasefire. It's not advantageous for them, you know? So, and then everything that the Ukrainian side puts forward is so ridiculous and out of just left field that there's no way that Russia would ever agree to it. So Russia is hearing from that side things that they will never agree to, which is basically they have to leave the entire country, give them their only warm water port, which is the Crimea, and all this other crazy stuff. They're not going to do that. So they're not giving back and forth that's legitimately good so that to even have a ceasefire and start talks, because the talks aren't even starting at a point that's reasonable, you know? So they're not serious. So they're basically asking them for a ceasefire for talks that are not even serious and not going to go anywhere.
To finally move towards a negotiated settlement of the conflict. So the Russians are not budging. They're not in the mood for ceasefires or anything of that kind. They said to Trump, look, unlike you with Iran, we are actually winning our war. It is for the Ukrainians and ultimately for you to move towards our position. We're not here to make any compromises. But I doubt that Ukraine was discussed very much. And interestingly, we're then told that the leaders also touched upon the issue of Venezuela, primarily in the context of the situation on the global oil market. I suspect it was Putin who brought up Venezuela and never said something to Trump about disruptions in the oil markets being largely caused by Trump's actions. And then Ushakov's briefing finishes. Overall, I would reiterate that the conversation was highly substantive. In other words, it dealt with the material issues and will undoubtedly have practical significance for further cooperation between our two countries across various areas of international policy, which again stops well short of saying that there was any actual agreement on the, or that there was any warmth, sincerity, or positive outcome to the discussions. But it does say that what happens next, whether there is going to be a resolution of the conflict in Iran, whether there is indeed going to be any progress on Ukraine, that is all going to weigh in future on the question of whether US-Russian relations can improve. So, coming back to what I was saying, that this call was clearly Trump's attempt to get Putin's help to try to find an off-ramp. When we pass Ushakov's briefing, we can clearly see that this is so. Putin, however, was in an extremely tough mood. He made it very, very clear to Trump that he thinks the entire approach taken towards Iran is disastrously wrong. And basically he said to Trump, look, if you want my help, in getting an off-ramp in this crisis, an end to the war, which is causing all this crisis in the energy markets, well, I am prepared, to the extent that I can, to give that help, though nowhere in the briefing do the Russians guarantee a successful outcome. They undoubtedly know how difficult it is going to be to persuade the Iranians to agree to anything, just say. But the Russians said that, yes, they will be prepared to offer that help, but it will have to be on terms that fall far short of Trump's objectives, regime change in Iran, and the total disarmament of Iran. Now, what might the Russians suggest? Well, it is actually not very difficult to work out. The Russians will suggest a return to the proposals that have been made on enrichment, and which the Iranians, by the way, previously showed willingness to agree to, the setting up of the consortium, the ending of enrichment to 60% levels, Rosatom's involvement on it, the strong safeguards to ensure it. The Russians undoubtedly were prepared to offer those things, but they will also insist on other things, undertakings that there will be no further attacks on Iran in the future, undertakings of the Americans. The Russians know perfectly well that the Iranians will not accept those undertakings. What I suspect the Russians will nonetheless do is that they will come to the Iranians and they will say, look, you've made your point, you've demonstrated your ability to defend yourselves. You've come out of this conflict the overall winners. You've shown that you can close the Straits of Hormuz, that you can attack American targets across the Middle East. The moment now has come for you to stop whilst you are ahead. Obviously, you can't trust the Americans. We're not expecting you to trust the Americans. We don't trust the Americans either. The whole tone of this briefing by Ushakov says that as well. As I said, no suggestions of sincerity, of honesty, of warmth, or anything of that kind. It's instead all about frankness and businesslike and exchange of views. It's that kind of language. That is not the language of trust between leaders. Anyway, the Russians will be telling the Iranians, we don't trust the Americans either. But after the battering, the Americans, their Gulf allies, and by the way, the Israelis, have suffered. If you come through this intact, as we can guarantee you will, then rest assured we will do all we can, provided you agree to make sure that next time you are more secure. We can move forward with that security partnership that we discussed when we were negotiating the partnership agreement that we signed off and ratified last year. You balked at moving forward with that. We might move forward with that. We will certainly move forward with weapons deliveries to you. We might even send some of our own personnel there, and perhaps
what he's talking about there is that the Iranians have been very, very stubborn on getting any kind of outside help from anyone. Like they will say over and over again that we're independent and we could do stuff on our own. So there are things that they have that Russia has tried to help them with that they have refused. Okay, like over the years and stuff. I'm not talking about necessarily super recently, but relatively recently and also in the past. And so Russia tries to do things for them or wants to help them out, like with their nuclear power energy and things like that. And then they just want to be super independent. And so they won't accept a lot of help like that. So that's one of the things that he's talking about there.
Going back to Ushakov's briefing, we see that Ushakov said that Putin set out a number of considerations aimed at achieving a prompt political and diplomatic settlement of the Iranian conflict. Notice that the briefing speaks of considerations rather than proposals. That, of course, is exactly what a mediator is supposed to do. Mediators are not supposed to be in the business of setting up proposals, just saying. But anyway, we read, US leaders, they were able to explain their opposition to this whole conflict to Trump and put him in no possible doubt about that. But perhaps because they also signaled to Trump that, as I said, if he was looking for an off-ramp, the Russians might indeed be in a position to provide it. And then we have the afterthought. President Trump once again expressed interest in bringing the conflict in Ukraine to an end as soon as possible by achieving a ceasefire that would open the way to a long-term settlement. So Trump is again talking about a ceasefire, which of course the Russians have rejected. Notice that the briefing does not say that Putin agreed with this. On the contrary, what Putin is reported to have said in response was that on our side, a positive assessment was given of the mediation efforts undertaken by Trump's team and by him personally. An assessment, however, was also provided of the current situation along the line of contact where Russian forces are advancing successfully. As was noted, this is a factor that should compel the Kiev regime to finally move towards a negotiated settlement of the conflict. So the Russians are not budging. They're not in the mood for ceasefires or anything of that kind. They said to Trump, look, unlike you with Iran, we are actually winning our war. It is for the Ukrainians and ultimately for you to move towards our position. We're not here to make any compromises, but I doubt that Ukraine was discussed very much. And interestingly, the We're then told that the leaders also touched upon the issue of Venezuela, primarily in the context of the situation on the global oil market. I suspect it was Putin who brought up Venezuela and may have said something to Trump about disruptions in the oil markets being largely caused by Trump's actions. And then Ushakov's briefing finishes. Overall, I would reiterate that the conversation was highly substantive. In other words, it dealt with the material issues and will undoubtedly have practical significance for further cooperation between our two countries across various areas of international policy, which again stops well short of saying that there was any actual agreement on the, or that there was any warmth, sincerity, or positive outcome to the discussions. But it does say that what happens next, whether there is going to be a resolution of the conflict in Iran, whether there is indeed going to be any progress on Ukraine, that is all going to weigh in future on the question of whether US-Russian relations can improve. So, coming back to what I was saying, that this call was clearly Trump's attempt to get Putin's help to try to find an off-ramp. When we pass Ushakov's briefing, we can clearly see that this is so. Putin, however, was in an extremely tough mood. He made it very, very clear to Trump that he thinks the entire approach taken towards Iran is disastrously wrong. And basically he said to Trump, look, if you want my help in getting an off-ramp in this crisis and end to the war, which is causing all this crisis in the energy markets, well, I am prepared, to the extent that I can, to give that help. Though nowhere in the briefing do the Russians guarantee a successful outcome. They undoubtedly know how difficult it is going to be to persuade the Iranians to agree to anything, just say. But the Russians said that, yes, they will. We provided you with intelligence assistance. Next time, if the Americans in a year or two are ready to attack you again, they will know that this time you are much stronger than you have been before. So the Russians might say all of these things. The Chinese might say all of these things. And the Russians will also remind the Iranians that the Russians are talking to the Gulf states. They have advised the Gulf states strongly against going to war themselves with Iran. It seems that the Gulf states are taking that advice. They've also indicated that they don't intend to join the coalition against Iran. Senator Lindsey Graham is furious about this, and he's now threatening Saudi Arabia incredibly because Saudi Arabia won't attack Iran. The Russians might say that if Iran agrees to some kind of off-ramp, to some kind of negotiated resolution, then Russia will move forward with the Gulf states to create some kind of security system in the Gulf, which will possibly preclude further military action against Iran. Now, I don't know whether the Iranians would accept that. I don't know whether the supreme leader, the new supreme leader, whose father has been killed, along with other members of his immediate family, would be prepared to agree to that. I don't know whether the IRGC would be prepared to agree to that either. I suspect it would be a very tough sell in Iran. I suspect that the guarantees Iran would have to receive would need to be very, very strong to get them to agree. But at least it is a potential way forward. The big question is Donald Trump, are the Americans, are the Israelis prepared to take it? This war has not gone well for them up to this time. Perhaps a sense of realism is growing. The report in the Wall Street Journal about US officials advising that the time has come to look for an exit strategy. The reports from Israel about discussions in Israel also about looking for a way out of the war. The reports, the comments rather, made by the president himself suggest the same thing. But, well, at this moment in time, it's far from clear either that the Iranians are prepared for an exit ramp or that Donald Trump and the people around him in Washington are. Some people, Lindsey Graham, for example, will never be. They will be furious if the war ends with the present government in Iran still in place and with Iran having refused to make any of the substantive concessions on ballistic missiles, on changing its foreign policy, these impossible, unreasonable demands that the United States and Israel were making on the eve of the war. So the gulf between the two sides is enormous. But all I will say is, if there is any individual who might be in a position to put the pieces back together, then it is Vladimir Putin. I cannot at this time think of anyone else. Now, of course, oil prices have been rising. Putin chaired another big meeting yesterday in which he talked about the importance of Russia ending further energy supplies to Europe. He was careful to make clear that countries in Europe which have been reliable customers, like Slovakia and Hungary, and I would add Yugoslavia, obviously that they will continue to receive the supplies that they need from Russia. But the various other unfriendly countries, the European Union, Britain, they will not receive such supplies. He also spoke about the importance for Russia of...
Okay, and that's not good. That's not good for Europe. Okay, so I think we're gonna leave that there. This is already gonna be extremely long. I have to edit it. Editing takes forever. Okay, so anyway, thank you guys for watching. Like I said, let's all just be praying for the best. Let's just pray that the best outcome will come. This has happened. The war has happened. The conflict has happened. The special military operation has happened. And we cannot go back from that. And so what we need to be focusing on now is that the best outcome will be achieved. Whatever the best outcome is that can possibly be achieved without further catastrophe in the Gulf states. Because if we start getting huge humanitarian crises, that's going to be a huge problem. We already have a serious issue with refugee crises that people are dealing with already. So I've heard from commentators in Britain that are really upset about this because they don't want any more refugees coming to Britain that they're already dealing with. And so the last thing we need is a giant humanitarian crisis across the entire Middle East region. Like, that is the last thing. Let's just pray that things don't get that even more crazy in that direction, you know? And if you guys want to see a video, I might do it even if you guys don't want to. But if you want to see videos of what it's like in Iran and hear from Iranian people themselves, then let me know. Yeah, thank you for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Please subscribe. And thank you for being here. And that's the end of that video. And I'll see you next time on The Eclectic Journalist.